The babysitter who watched the same house for 20 years. What she found in the attic changed everything. Mrs. Chen had watched the Morrison children grow up. She knew where Tommy hid his vegetables, which bedtime story Emma preferred, and exactly how to calm baby Jake when he cried. What she didn't know was why Mr. Morrison had told her never, under any circumstances, to go into the attic. Until the night 8-year-old Tommy vanished and the scratching sounds from above became too loud to ignore. It started like any other Thursday evening in October 2019. Mrs. Chen arrived at the Morrison house at exactly 6:30 p.m., just as she had every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 20 years. The familiar routine began immediately. Emma, now 15, was sprawled across the living room couch with her phone, texting friends about some drama at school. Jake, 12, sat cross-legged on the carpet, controller in hand, battling digital monsters on the television screen. And Tommy, the middle child at 8 years old, was supposed to be upstairs doing his homework. Margaret Chan had been babysitting since she was 19, fresh off the boat from Taiwan with limited English and unlimited determination. Now, at 39, she spoke perfect English, had earned her citizenship, and had watched 3 generations of children in Millfield's suburban neighborhoods. But the Morrison family had become her specialty, her second family, her home away from home. "Mrs. Chen," Emma called without looking up from her phone. "Mom left dinner in the fridge. Just microwave it when you're ready." The teenager's voice carried the casual affection of someone who had grown up with this woman as a constant presence in her life. Mrs. Chen smiled, hanging her coat on the hook by the front door. "Thank you, Emma. Where are your parents going tonight?" "Dad's work thing, some conference in the city. They'll be back around midnight." Jake looked up from his game, grinning. "Mrs. Chen, can we watch a scary movie after Tommy goes to bed?" "We'll see," she replied, using the same gentle but non-committal tone she'd perfected over 2 decades of managing children's requests. "First homework, then dinner, then we'll talk about movies." Mrs. Chen had developed a system over the years: check in with each child, assess moods and energy levels, and adjust her approach accordingly. Emma was in her typical teenage phase, more interested in her social life than family interaction, but still respectful and helpful when needed. Jake was energetic and creative, the type of child who needed structured activities to avoid getting into mischief. And Tommy, sweet Tommy, was the dreamer of the family, often lost in elaborate fantasy worlds of his own creation. She climbed the stairs to check on him, her feet moving silently across the familiar carpet. The Morrison house was a large colonial built in the 1950s, with 4 bedrooms upstairs and a finished basement below. Mrs. Chen knew every creak of the floorboards, every squeaky door hinge, every light switch and thermostat setting. After 20 years, she could navigate the house in complete darkness. Tommy's bedroom door was closed, which was unusual. Typically, he left it open while doing homework, calling out random questions about math problems or asking her to settle disputes with his stuffed animals. Mrs. Chen knocked gently. "Tommy, how's the homework coming along?" Silence. She knocked again, slightly louder. "Tommy, it's Mrs. Chen. May I come in?" Still no response. A small flutter of concern stirred in her chest. She turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. The bedroom was empty. Tommy's backpack sat on his desk, homework papers scattered around it. His pencil lay on the floor as if it had been dropped suddenly. The window was closed and locked from the inside. Mrs. Chen frowned, moving to check the small closet. Empty except for clothes and toys. Under the bed revealed only dust bunnies and forgotten action figures. "Tommy?" she called, moving back into the hallway. Perhaps he had gone to use the bathroom or had snuck downstairs for a snack. "Emma, have you seen Tommy?" "He's upstairs doing homework," Emma replied from the living room, still focused on her phone. "When did you last see him?" "I don't know, like an hour ago. He was complaining about some math worksheet." Mrs. Chen began a methodical search of the house. Bathroom empty, parents' bedroom empty, guest bedroom empty, Jake's room empty except for the lingering scent of the cologne he'd started wearing to impress girls at school. She went downstairs, checking the kitchen, living room, dining room, and Mr. Morrison's home office. No Tommy. The basement came next, though she doubted he would be down there. The space was used primarily for storage and laundry, Not the kind of place that would interest an 8-year-old, but she checked anyway, calling his name into the shadows between boxes and furniture. Jake, she said, returning to the living room with forced calm in her voice. Have you seen your brother recently? The 12-year-old paused his game and looked up with mild annoyance. No, why? He's supposed to be doing homework. I can't find him. He's not in his room and he's not anywhere else in the house. Emma finally looked up from her phone, her expression shifting from boredom to concern. What do you mean you can't find him? Exactly that. His homework is still on his desk, but Tommy isn't there. Jake set down his controller. Maybe he's hiding. He does that sometimes when he doesn't want to do math. Help me look again, Mrs. Chen said. Emma, you check the basement thoroughly. Jake, you look in all the bedrooms again, including places he might be hiding. I'll check outside. The October evening was crisp and clear, with the scent of burning leaves carried on a gentle breeze. Mrs. Chen walked around the entire perimeter of the Morrison property, calling Tommy's name. The backyard was enclosed by a tall wooden fence, and the gate was locked from the inside. Even if Tommy had wanted to leave the property, he would have had to go through the front door, which Mrs. Chen would have seen from the living room. She checked the garage, the tool shed, even looked up into the large oak tree where she knew Tommy sometimes liked to climb. Nothing. 20 minutes of searching had yielded no trace of an 8-year-old boy who had simply vanished from his bedroom while doing homework. When she returned to the house, Emma and Jake were waiting for her in the kitchen, both looking worried now. We looked everywhere, Emma reported. I even checked all the closets and under every bed. Jake looked in the basement storage room and behind all the boxes. He's not outside either, Mrs. Chen said, pulling out her phone. I'm going to call your parents. Wait, Jake said suddenly. What about the attic? Did anyone check the attic? Mrs. Chen paused, her finger hovering over Mr. Morrison's contact information. The attic is locked, Jake. Your father has always said it's off limits because it's not safe. But maybe Tommy found a way up there somehow. He's pretty good at climbing things. Emma shook her head. Dad's really serious about the attic rule. He's never even let us look at the door. Said there's old electrical stuff up there that could be dangerous. Mrs. Chen had indeed noticed Mr. Morrison's strict policy regarding the attic over the years. The access door was located at the end of the upstairs hallway, secured with a heavy padlock that looked almost industrial in its design. Whenever she had asked about it during her early years with the family, Mr. Morrison had simply said it contained old electrical equipment and building materials that posed safety hazards. She had never questioned it further. But now, with Tommy missing and all other possibilities exhausted, the attic represented the only unchecked space in the house. Let me call your father first, she decided. He can tell us whether it's possible for Tommy to have gotten up there somehow. Mr. Morrison answered on the third ring. Hi, Margaret. Is everything okay? His voice carried the slight tension of a parent receiving an unexpected call from the babysitter. Mr. Morrison, I don't want to alarm you, but I can't find Tommy anywhere in the house. We've searched everywhere, and I was wondering, what do you mean you can't find him? The tension ratcheted up several notches. He was in his room doing homework when I arrived. When I went to check on him about 30 minutes ago, he was gone. We've looked in every room, outside, everywhere. The only place we haven't checked is the attic. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Margaret, listen to me very carefully. Tommy cannot be in the attic. That door has been locked for 15 years, and I have the only key with me. It's impossible for him to be up there. But Mr. Morrison, we've looked everywhere else. Could he have found another way? There is no other way into the attic, he interrupted. Keep looking. Check places you might have missed. He has to be somewhere in the house. But as Mrs. Chen hung up the phone, she became aware of a sound she hadn't noticed before. A soft scratching noise, rhythmic and persistent, coming from somewhere above the kitchen. She looked up at the ceiling, following the sound with her eyes. Emma and Jake had heard it too. What is that? Emma whispered. The scratching continued, moving slowly across the ceiling from one end of the kitchen to the other. It sounded exactly like someone crawling across wooden floorboards, dragging something behind them. Tommy? Mrs. Chen called upward, her voice barely above a whisper. The scratching stopped immediately. The house fell into complete silence, as if even the normal sounds of settling wood and humming appliances had paused to listen. Then, faintly but unmistakably, came Tommy's voice from somewhere above their heads. "Mrs. Chen, I'm scared. I can't get down. There's something up here with me." The three of them stared at the ceiling in shock. Tommy was definitely in the attic, despite his father's insistence that it was impossible. And from the terror in his voice, he was not alone. Mrs. Chen's heart hammered against her ribs as she stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the ceiling where Tommy's voice had just echoed from above. 20 years of babysitting experience had prepared her for many things: scraped knees, temper tantrums, homework meltdowns, and even the occasional emergency room visit. But nothing had prepared her for a child who had somehow vanished into a supposedly locked and inaccessible attic space. Emma and Jake flanked her on either side, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and confusion. The house seemed to hold its breath around them, as if the very walls were waiting to see what would happen next. "Tommy?" Mrs. Chen called upward, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "Can you hear me, sweetheart?" From above came a shuffling sound, like someone crawling across wooden boards, followed by Tommy's voice, muffled but clearly audible. "Mrs. Chen, I'm scared. It's really dark up here, and I think there's someone else. I can hear them moving around, but I can't see them. Please help me get down." Mrs. Chen exchanged glances with Emma and Jake. The terror in Tommy's voice was genuine, but the impossibility of the situation made her question her own sanity. Mr. Morrison had been adamant that the attic was locked and inaccessible, yet his son was clearly up there, frightened and possibly not alone. "Okay, Tommy, listen to me very carefully," Mrs. Chen called. "Stay exactly where you are. Don't move toward any sounds you hear, and don't try to come down by yourself. We're going to figure out how to get you out of there." She pulled out her phone and immediately called Mr. Morrison back. He answered before the first ring had finished. "Margaret, did you find him?" "Mr. Morrison, Tommy is in the attic. I can hear him talking to me through the ceiling. He says he's scared and that there might be someone else up there with him." The silence that followed was so profound that Mrs. Chen thought the call had dropped. "Mr. Morrison, are you there?" "That's impossible," he said finally, his voice strange and tight. "Margaret, I'm telling you, that door has been locked for 15 years. There is no way for a child to get into that attic." "But I can hear him," Mrs. Chen insisted. "Emma and Jake can hear him too. He's definitely up there, and he's frightened. You need to come home right now and bring whatever key opens that attic door." Another long pause. When Mr. Morrison spoke again, his voice carried an undertone that Mrs. Chen had never heard before. Fear, yes, but also something else. Something that sounded almost like guilt. "We're leaving the conference now. We'll be home in an hour. Whatever you do, don't try to get into that attic. Don't even touch that door. Do you understand me?" The urgency and almost desperate quality in his voice sent chills down Mrs. Chen's spine. "Mr. Morrison, if Tommy is hurt or in danger, just promise me you won't go near that door until we get home. Promise me, Margaret." Mrs. Chen looked up at the ceiling, where she could still hear occasional movement and Tommy's voice calling for help. Every instinct she had screamed at her to find a way to reach the child immediately. But Mr. Morrison's tone suggested there were complexities to this situation that she didn't understand. "I promise," she said reluctantly, "but please hurry. Tommy is really scared." After ending the call, Mrs. Chen found herself pacing the kitchen, her mind racing through possibilities. How had Tommy gotten into a locked attic? Why was Mr. Morrison so adamant about not approaching the door? And most disturbing of all, who or what else might be up there with an 8-year-old boy? Emma sat at the kitchen table, her phone forgotten in her lap. "Mrs. Chen, what if Tommy's hurt? What if he fell through the ceiling somehow and now he's trapped?" "I don't think that's what happened," Mrs. Chen replied, though she wasn't sure what she did think had happened. "The ceiling looks intact and Tommy doesn't sound like he's injured, just scared." Jake had positioned himself directly under the spot where they could hear Tommy moving around. "Tommy," he called upward. "It's Jake. Are you okay? Can you tell us how you got up there?" "I don't know," came Tommy's muffled reply. "I was doing my math homework, and I heard this weird music coming from somewhere in the walls. Like singing, but really old-fashioned singing. I followed the sound, and I found a door I'd never seen before. It was behind the bookshelf in the hallway, but when I pushed on it, the bookshelf moved. Mrs. Chen felt her blood run cold. A hidden door behind the hallway bookshelf. In 20 years of babysitting this family, she had never noticed anything unusual about that bookshelf. But then again, she had never had reason to examine it closely. "Tommy, this is very important," she called. "Is the door still open? Can you see a way back down?" "I think so, but it's really dark. And Mrs. Chen, there are boxes up here. Lots and lots of old boxes and pictures." And his voice dropped to a whisper. "I think someone's been living up here. There's a bed and some food and water, but everything's really dusty, like it's been here for a long time." Emma stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the kitchen floor. "Someone's been living in our attic? For how long?" Mrs. Chen held up a hand for silence, straining to hear any other sounds from above. There was Tommy's breathing and occasional movement, but underneath that, she thought she could detect something else. A very faint humming, as if someone were singing a lullaby under their breath. "Tommy," she called, "the person you think might be up there with you. Can you see them? Can you tell me anything about them?" A long pause, during which the humming seemed to grow slightly louder. "I can't see them very well because it's so dark, but I think it's a lady. She's sitting in a corner, and she keeps singing the same song over and over. She doesn't seem to notice I'm here." Mrs. Chen felt the hair on her arms stand up. A woman living secretly in the Morrison family attic for an unknown period of time, singing to herself in the darkness. And now an 8-year-old boy was trapped up there with her. "Tommy, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Mrs. Chen said, working to keep her voice calm and reassuring. "Don't try to talk to the lady. Don't get close to her. Just stay right where you are and keep talking to me so I know you're safe. Your parents are coming home, and they'll know how to get you down." "Okay, Mrs. Chen, but the lady stopped singing. I think she heard you talking." The silence that followed was the most terrifying sound Mrs. Chen had ever experienced. No humming, no movement, just the awful quiet of someone who was listening and waiting. And then, from directly above the kitchen, came a woman's voice, clear, coherent, and filled with a desperate sadness that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. "Margaret Chen," the voice said, "I've been waiting so long to talk to you. So very, very long." Mrs. Chen's phone slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered to the floor. The woman in the attic knew her name, had been waiting for her, and from the sound of her voice she had a story to tell that was going to change everything Mrs. Chen thought she knew about the Morrison family and the house where she had spent the last 20 years of her life. The woman's voice from the attic had frozen Mrs. Chen's blood, but now she forced herself to move. She bent down, picked up her phone from the kitchen floor, and took a deep breath. Emma and Jake stood beside her, both pale with fear but trying to be brave. The house seemed to pulse around them, as if the very walls were holding secrets that were finally ready to spill forth. Mrs. Chen had spent 20 years in this house, caring for these children, and she had never suspected that someone else had been living just above their heads all this time. "Emma, Jake, I need you both to go to your rooms and lock the doors," Mrs. Chen said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "Don't come out until your parents get home, or until I come to get you personally." Emma started to protest. "But Mrs. Chen, what about Tommy? And who is that woman up there? How long has she been living in our attic?" Mrs. Chen placed gentle hands on both teenagers' shoulders. "I don't know yet, sweetheart, but I'm going to find out. The most important thing right now is keeping you and Jake safe while we figure out what's happening." Jake's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Mrs. Chen, what if the woman up there is dangerous? What if she hurt Tommy?" The thought had occurred to Mrs. Chen as well, but Tommy's voice had sounded more frightened than hurt. And the woman's voice when she had spoken Mrs. Chen's name had carried a desperate sadness rather than malice. Still, she couldn't be certain of anything in this impossible situation. "I don't think she wants to hurt anyone," Mrs. Chen said carefully, "but we need to be cautious until we understand more. Please, just go to your rooms and wait for me." Reluctantly, Emma and Jake headed upstairs, their footsteps heavy on the wooden steps. Mrs. Chen waited until she heard their bedroom doors close and lock before she allowed herself to look up at the ceiling again. "Tommy," she called softly, "are you still there, sweetheart?" "Yes, Mrs. Chen." The lady is sitting closer to me now. She keeps looking at me, but she's not saying anything mean. She just looks really, really sad. Mrs. Chen's heart ached for both the frightened child and the mysterious woman who had somehow been hidden in this house for an unknown period of time. "Tommy, can you tell me anything else about where you are? What does it look like up there?" "It's like a secret room, but bigger than my bedroom. There are lots of boxes and old furniture, and there's a little bed in one corner with blankets. It smells kind of musty, like Grandma's basement used to smell." The description painted a picture that made Mrs. Chen feel sick to her stomach. Someone had been living in the Morrison family's attic, possibly for years, with basic furniture and belongings. But who was she, and how had she gotten there? More importantly, why hadn't the family known about her existence? Mr. Morrison's extreme reaction to the idea of anyone going near the attic suddenly took on a much more sinister meaning. "Tommy, I need to ask you something very important. When you found the hidden door behind the bookshelf, was it locked? Did you have to force it open?" "No, Mrs. Chen, it wasn't locked at all. When I pushed on the bookshelf, it just moved aside like it was supposed to, like someone had made it so it would open easily." Mrs. Chen felt a chill run down her spine. A hidden entrance that moved easily, as if it had been designed for regular access. This wasn't a case of someone breaking into the house and hiding in the attic. This was something much more deliberate and planned. Someone had created this secret living space intentionally. And given Mr. Morrison's knowledge of the locked attic door and his desperate insistence that no one go near it, he had to be involved somehow. The question was whether his involvement made him a victim or a perpetrator. "The lady wants to talk to you again," Tommy said suddenly. "She says she has something important to tell you." Mrs. Chen looked up at the ceiling, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm listening," she called. The woman's voice drifted down, clearer now, as if she had moved closer to whatever opening allowed sound to travel between the attic and the kitchen. "Margaret Chen, you have been good to this family. You have loved these children as your own. That's why I chose to speak to you tonight. That's why I've been waiting for the right moment to reveal myself." Mrs. Chen swallowed hard. "Who are you? How long have you been up there?" "My name is Sarah Morrison. I am David's first wife. I am Emma and Jake's mother, and I have been dead for 15 years. The words hit Mrs. Chen like a physical blow. She staggered backward, catching herself against the kitchen counter. Sarah Morrison, David's first wife, had died in a car accident when Emma was just a baby and Jake was a toddler. Mrs. Chen had seen the death certificate, had comforted Mr. Morrison through his grief, had helped care for Emma and Jake during the difficult transition after their mother's death. She had even attended the memorial service. Mrs. Chen remembered the closed casket funeral, the way Mr. Morrison had been too devastated to speak, the tragic story of a young mother taken too soon by a drunk driver on a rainy night. But now a woman claiming to be Sarah Morrison was speaking to her from the attic of the family home, saying she had been dead for 15 years while apparently living in secret just above their heads. Mrs. Chen's rational mind rejected the possibility immediately. Dead people don't live in attics. Dead people don't speak to babysitters through kitchen ceilings. This had to be some kind of delusion, or fraud, or psychological break. But the woman's voice was so clear, so certain, and the intimate knowledge she had displayed about Mrs. Chen's name and role in the family suggested a connection that went far beyond coincidence. "That's impossible," Mrs. Chen said aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah Morrison died in 1998. There was a funeral. I was there." "There was a funeral, yes, but it wasn't for me. David needed people to believe I was dead. He needed a reason for my disappearance that wouldn't lead to questions about what really happened. So he staged an accident, held a service for an empty casket, and let everyone mourn the tragic young mother who died too soon." The woman's voice carried a bitter sadness that seemed to seep through the walls of the house. "What really happened was much worse than a car accident, Margaret. What really happened was that I discovered something about my husband that he couldn't allow me to share with the world." Mrs. Chen felt as though the floor was shifting beneath her feet. Everything she thought she knew about the Morrison family, about the man she had worked for, and respected for 20 years, was crumbling around her. "What did you discover?" she asked, though part of her was terrified to hear the answer. "I discovered that David Morrison is not the loving father and respected businessman that everyone believes him to be. I discovered that he has been involved in activities that would destroy his reputation and send him to prison for the rest of his life. And when I threatened to expose him, he made me disappear." The sound of a car pulling into the driveway interrupted the surreal conversation. Through the kitchen window, Mrs. Chen could see the headlights of Mr. Morrison's sedan sweeping across the garage door. He was home nearly an hour earlier than he had promised, and somehow Mrs. Chen suspected that his early arrival was not a coincidence. "He's here," the woman in the attic said, her voice suddenly urgent and frightened. "Margaret, you and the children are in danger now. David knows that his secret is about to be exposed, and he will do anything to protect himself. You have to get Emma and Jake out of this house immediately." Mrs. Chen heard the car doors slam shut outside, followed by the sound of rapid footsteps approaching the front door. Mr. Morrison was not alone. She could hear at least two other voices, male voices, speaking in low, tense tones. "Tommy," she called desperately toward the ceiling, "you need to hide up there right now. Don't make any noise. Don't let anyone know where you are. Can you do that for me?" "Yes, Mrs. Chen. The lady says she'll help me hide." The front door opened with the sound of the key turning in the lock. Mr. Morrison's voice carried through the house, artificially calm, but with an underlying tension that Mrs. Chen had never heard before. "Margaret, where are you? We need to talk." Mrs. Chen looked around the kitchen frantically, her mind racing through options. She could try to get upstairs to Emma and Jake, but Mr. Morrison and his companions were already in the house and would see her. She could try to call the police, but what would she tell them? That a dead woman was living in the attic? She could try to run, but she couldn't leave the children behind. As footsteps approached the kitchen, Mrs. Chen made a decision that would change all their lives forever. She slipped her phone into her pocket, grabbed a large kitchen knife from the wooden block on the counter, and positioned herself between the kitchen entrance and the stairs leading to the children's bedrooms. Mr. Morrison appeared in the doorway, and Mrs. Chen immediately knew that this was not the same man she had worked for over the past 20 years. Gone was the gentle, caring father she had known. In his place stood someone whose eyes held a coldness that made her blood freeze. Behind him stood two other men, both large and intimidating, both wearing expressions that suggested they were accustomed to violence. "Margaret," Mr. Morrison said, his voice deceptively pleasant, "I understand you've been having some unusual experiences tonight, some conversations that couldn't possibly have happened." Mrs. Chen gripped the knife handle tighter, her knuckles white with tension. "David, what's going on? Who are these men? And where have you been for the past 20 years when your wife needed you?" Mr. Morrison's pleasant expression flickered for just a moment, revealing something dark and dangerous underneath. "My wife has been dead for 15 years, Margaret. You know that. You attended her funeral. Whatever you think you heard tonight was just the stress of the situation playing tricks on your mind." But from directly above them came Sarah Morrison's voice, clear and strong, and filled with 15 years of suppressed rage. "Hello, David. Did you miss me?" The two men behind Mr. Trey Morrison immediately looked up at the ceiling, their hands moving instinctively toward weapons concealed beneath their jackets. Mr. Morrison himself went completely white, as if he had seen a ghost, which Mrs. Chen realized was exactly what he thought was happening. And in that moment of shock and recognition, Mrs. Chen understood that she was standing in the middle of a horror story that had been unfolding for 2 decades, with innocent children caught in the center of a web of lies, deception, and violence that was about to finally come to light. The silence that followed Mr. Morrison's appearance in the kitchen doorway was broken only by Sarah Morrison's voice floating down from the attic, like a ghost finding her tongue after 15 years of enforced silence. Mrs. Chen watched as the color drained from Mr. Morrison's face, watched as his two companions instinctively reached for weapons, watched as 20 years of carefully constructed lies began to crumble around them all. The knife in her hand felt both impossibly heavy and inadequately small against the magnitude of what was unfolding in this suburban kitchen that had hosted countless family dinners, homework sessions, and bedtime snack preparations. "Hello, David," Sarah's voice continued from above. each word carrying the weight of 15 years of captivity. I've been waiting for this moment for so long, waiting for someone brave enough to find me, someone who loved my children enough to risk everything for the truth. Mr. Morrison's mouth opened and closed without sound, his face cycling through expressions of shock, fear, and something that looked almost like relief. Behind him, the two men Mrs. Chen now realized must be associates of some kind began whispering urgently, their eyes scanning the ceiling as if they could locate the source of the impossible voice through sheer force of will. "Margaret," Mr. Morrison finally managed to say, his voice hoarse and strained, "you don't understand what you've stumbled into. This situation is far more complicated than you can imagine." Mrs. Chen shifted her grip on the kitchen knife, positioning herself more firmly between these men and the staircase that led to Emma and Jake's bedrooms. "Then explain it to me, David. Explain how your wife, who I mourned alongside you, who I helped you grieve, has been living in your attic for 15 years. Explain why you've been keeping her prisoner in her own home while raising her children to believe she was dead." The larger of the two men behind Mr. Morrison stepped forward, his hand now clearly visible inside his jacket where a shoulder holster would rest. "Ma'am, you need to put that knife down and step aside. This is a delicate situation that requires professional handling." Mrs. Chen had never been in a situation remotely similar to this, but her instincts were screaming that these men were not police officers or social workers or anyone else who might have legitimate authority in this situation. They moved like predators, spoke like people accustomed to using intimidation and violence to solve problems. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Show me identification. Call the police. If this is such a delicate situation, then let's get proper authorities involved." Mr. Morrison laughed, but the sound was bitter and desperate. "Margaret, the authorities can't be involved in this. You have no idea what you're asking for." From the attic, Sarah's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Tell her, David. Tell her what you really do for a living. Tell her why you couldn't let me leave when I found out. Tell her why you chose to let our children grow up believing their mother was dead rather than risk your precious career." Mrs. Chen felt pieces of a horrible puzzle beginning to click together in her mind. The unexplained wealth that had allowed the Morrison family to live in a house far beyond what a regional sales manager could afford. The business trips that took Mr. Morrison away for weeks at a time with vague explanations about client meetings and conference attendance. The phone calls that came at strange hours. Conversations held in his home office with the door closed and his voice carefully muted. "David Morrison isn't a sales manager," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength with each revelation. "He's been laundering money for organized crime families for over 20 years. The regional sales position is a cover story. His real job is moving dirty money through fake business transactions, creating paper trails that make drug money and extortion payments look like legitimate business profits." Mrs. Chen stared at Mr. Morrison, watching as his carefully maintained facade finally cracked completely. The gentle, devoted father she had known for 2 decades was dissolving before her eyes, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "I never wanted this," Mr. Morrison said quietly, speaking more to himself than to anyone else in the room. "I never wanted Sarah to get involved. I tried to keep the business separate from the family, but she was too smart, too curious. She found documents, bank statements, records that I thought were safely hidden. When she confronted me, when she threatened to go to the authorities, I knew I had to make a choice." The second man, who had remained silent until now, spoke with a slight accent that Mrs. Chen couldn't identify. "The choice was simple. Eliminate the threat or lose everything. You made the smart decision, David." Mrs. Chen felt sick to her stomach as the full implication of those words sank in. "You were supposed to kill her. That's why there was a funeral with a closed casket. You were supposed to murder your wife, the mother of your children, to protect your criminal career." Mr. Morrison's shoulders sagged as if he were carrying an enormous weight. "I couldn't do it. When it came time to, I couldn't pull the trigger. So I kept her instead. I told my associates that she was dead, held a funeral service to make it convincing, and then I hid her in the attic. I thought it would be temporary, just until I could figure out another solution." 15 years, David? Sarah's voice was now sharp with anger. 15 years of being dead to my children. 15 years of listening to them cry for a mother they thought had abandoned them. 15 years of watching you marry that woman and bring her into my home, into my bed, while I rotted away above your heads like some shameful secret. Mrs. Chen's mind reeled. A second wife. Mr. Morrison had remarried at some point, though she had no memory of meeting another Mrs. Morrison. But then, her relationship with the family was primarily focused on the children. And if Mr. Morrison had been careful to keep his personal life separate from his child care arrangements. Where is she now? Ms. Chen asked. Your second wife. Where is she while this is all happening? The larger man answered before Mr. Morrison could speak. She's not a problem anymore. Some people ask too many questions, just like the first wife. We've gotten better at handling that particular issue over the years. The casual way he spoke about murder, as if discussing the weather or traffic conditions, made Mrs. Chen's blood freeze. These weren't just criminals. These were people for whom violence was a routine business tool, people who killed without hesitation or remorse. From upstairs, she could hear movement in Emma and Jake's bedrooms. The teenagers were probably listening at their doors, trying to understand what was happening downstairs. Mrs. Chen prayed they would stay hidden, would stay safe, at least until she could figure out how to get them out of this nightmare. Tommy, she called toward the ceiling, are you still okay up there? I'm okay, Mrs. Chen. The lady is holding my hand. She says everything is going to be all right. The image of an 8-year-old boy being comforted by a woman who had been imprisoned for 15 years was almost too heartbreaking to bear. Mr. Morrison stepped closer, his expression now pleading rather than threatening. Margaret, I know how this looks, but you have to understand, I never meant for any of this to happen. I got involved with these people when Emma was just a baby and Jake was barely walking. Sarah was spending money we didn't have. We were behind on the mortgage. I was facing bankruptcy. When they offered me a way to make real money, good money, I thought it would just be temporary. Mrs. Chen kept the knife pointed at him as he spoke. So you chose money over your family's safety. You chose crime over honesty. And when your wife discovered the truth, you chose to let her disappear, rather than give up your criminal lifestyle. I chose to keep her alive, Mr. Morrison said desperately. My associates wanted me to kill her. They gave me explicit orders to eliminate the threat. But I couldn't murder the mother of my children, so I found another way. I've been protecting her for 15 years, keeping her safe, keeping her fed and housed and cared for. Sarah's laughter from the attic was harsh and broken. Protected? You call what you did to me protection? You locked me away from my children, David. You let them grow up believing I was dead while you remarried and played house with some other woman. You stole 15 years of my life, 15 years of watching Emma and Jake grow up, and you call that protection? The emotion in her voice was raw and devastating. Mrs. Chen could only imagine the psychological torture of being forced to listen to your children's lives from above, never able to comfort them, never able to hold them, never able to be the mother they needed. It was a cruelty beyond anything she had ever imagined. Why now? Mrs. Chen asked. Why is Tommy able to find the hidden door now? Why are you revealing yourself tonight? Because David's associates are getting impatient, Sarah replied. They've decided that keeping me alive was a mistake, a loose end that needs to be tied up. They're here tonight to finish what they started 15 years ago. Mrs. Chen looked at the two men flanking Mr. Morrison and saw the truth in their cold, professional expressions. They hadn't come here to help with a family crisis. They had come to commit murder, to eliminate a witness who had been a liability for far too long. And now, because Tommy had accidentally discovered the hidden entrance, because Mrs. Chen had insisted on investigating strange sounds in the attic, they were all witnesses to crimes that these men would kill to keep secret. The knife in her hand suddenly felt like a pathetic defense against trained killers who had probably done this kind of work dozens of times before. But as she stood there, faced with the collapse of everything she thought she knew about the family she had devoted her life to, Mrs. Chen realized that she was no longer just a babysitter caught in an impossible situation. She was the only thing standing between three innocent children and people who would murder them without hesitation to protect their secrets. And for the first time in 20 years of caring for other people's children, Mrs. Chen discovered that she was willing to kill to protect the family she had chosen as her own. The standoff in the Morrison kitchen had transformed into something out of a nightmare that Mrs. Chen could never have imagined in 20 years of childcare. The knife in her hand felt both insignificant and desperately necessary as she faced down three dangerous men, while the impossible voice of a supposedly dead woman continued to drift down from the attic above. Tommy was still up there, hidden somewhere in the darkness with Sarah Morrison, while Emma and Jake remained locked in their bedrooms, hopefully safe from the escalating violence that was about to consume their home. The larger of Mr. Morrison's two associates took another step forward, his hand now fully visible on the grip of his weapon. "Ma'am, this situation has gone far enough. You need to put that knife down and step aside so we can handle this properly." Mrs. Chen had never been in a situation remotely like this, but her maternal instincts were screaming that these men represented mortal danger to the children she had devoted her life to protecting. "Handle it how?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "By murdering everyone who knows your secrets? By killing three innocent children to cover up 15 years of lies?" From the attic, Sarah's voice cut through the tension with desperate urgency. "Margaret, they've already decided to kill all of you. David's associates don't believe in leaving witnesses. They're going to eliminate everyone in this house tonight and make it look like a home invasion gone wrong." Mr. Morrison's face had gone completely white, and Mrs. Chen could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool October evening. "That wasn't the plan," he said, his voice cracking. "You said we were just going to move Sarah to a more secure location. You said no one would get hurt." The second man, the one with the slight accent, laughed coldly. "Plans change, David. Your wife has been a liability for 15 years, and now your babysitter and children have become liabilities as well. We clean this up tonight or we all go to prison." Mrs. Chen felt ice forming in her stomach as the full scope of their danger became clear. These weren't just criminals protecting their illegal activities. These were professional killers who eliminated problems with methodical efficiency. And everyone in this house had just become a problem that needed to be solved. "Emma! Jake!" Mrs. Chen shouted toward the ceiling, her voice carrying through the house. "Get out of the house right now. Go to the neighbors. Call 911. She could hear movement upstairs, doors opening, young voices calling back in confusion and fear. But she also heard something else. Heavy footsteps on the wooden floors above, moving fast toward the children's bedrooms. A third man, someone who had been positioned upstairs while she was focused on the confrontation in the kitchen. "There's someone else up there," she said, her blood turning cold. "You brought backup." The larger man smiled, and the expression was more terrifying than any threat he could have spoken. "We always bring backup, ma'am. This is a professional operation." From upstairs came the sound of Emma screaming, followed by Jake's voice shouting for help. Then Tommy's voice from the attic, high and terrified, calling for Mrs. Chen. The family she had protected and loved for 20 years was under attack from multiple directions, and she was trapped in a kitchen with two armed killers while a third one hunted the children above. Mrs. Chen had never killed anyone in her life, had never even held a weapon with the intent to cause harm. But as she listened to the children's terrified voices, as she calculated the impossible odds of getting all of them out of this alive, she made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She was not going to let these monsters murder the Morrison children. Not while she still drew breath. "David," she said, not taking her eyes off the two men threatening her, "you have one chance to do the right thing. Help me save your children." Mr. Morrison stood frozen between his criminal associates and the woman who had been like family to him for 20 years. His face cycled through expressions of guilt, fear, and desperate calculation. "Margaret, you don't understand. If we cross these people, they'll hunt us for the rest of our lives. They'll kill everyone we've ever cared about." Mrs. Chen adjusted her grip on the knife. "They're already killing everyone we care about. What's left to lose?" The sound of footsteps on the stairs indicated that someone was coming down from the second floor. Mrs. Chen prayed it was Emma or Jake escaping, but the heavy, measured tread suggested it was the third killer, probably dragging one of the children as a hostage. When the footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, Mrs. Chen's worst fears were confirmed. A tall man in dark clothes appeared in the kitchen doorway, his arm wrapped around Emma's throat, a gun pressed to her temple. The 15-year-old's eyes were wide with terror, and Mrs. Chen could see bruises already forming on her face where she had been struck or manhandled. "We have a problem," the third man announced to his partners. The boy got away, went out his bedroom window onto the roof, probably trying to reach the neighbors. Mrs. Chen felt a flicker of hope. If Jake had escaped, if he could reach help, there might still be a chance to save the others. But Emma was now a hostage, and Tommy was still trapped in the attic with Sarah. The odds were still impossibly stacked against them. "Let her go," Mrs. Chen said, her voice shaking with rage. "She's just a child. She has nothing to do with your business." The man holding Emma laughed. "She's David Morrison's daughter. She's got everything to do with our business." From the attic, Sarah's voice carried down with desperate maternal fury. "If you hurt my daughter, I will make you regret it for whatever brief time you have left to live." The threat from a woman who had been imprisoned for 15 years might have seemed empty, but there was something in her tone that made even the hardened criminals pause. "Margaret," Sarah continued, "there's something you need to know about this house. Something David never told anyone." Mrs. Chen kept her eyes on the men threatening her family, but she listened intently to Sarah's words. Any information, any advantage might be the difference between life and death for all of them. "When David renovated this house 15 years ago, when he created my prison in the attic, he also installed other modifications. Security measures to protect his criminal activities. There are panic rooms, hidden passages, and emergency exits that he never told you about." Mr. Morrison's face went even paler. "Sarah, don't." But his wife's voice continued with cold determination. "The bookshelf that Tommy found, that's not the only hidden door in this house. There's another entrance behind the kitchen pantry that leads to an underground tunnel connecting to the storm drain system. If you can reach it, you can get the children out safely." Mrs. Chen glanced toward the pantry, a narrow closet beside the refrigerator where the family stored canned goods and cleaning supplies. She had organized those shelves hundreds of times over the years and had never noticed anything unusual. But if Sarah was telling the truth, if there really was a hidden escape route just a few feet away, it might be their only chance. "How do I open it?" she called toward the ceiling. "There's a false panel at the back of the bottom shelf. Push on the right side and it will swing inward." The man holding Emma pressed his gun harder against her temple. "Nobody's going anywhere. We finish this here and now." But Mrs. Chen had already made her decision. In one fluid motion, she threw the kitchen knife directly at the man's face, not to kill him, but to startle him into loosening his grip on Emma. As the blade flew through the air, she dove toward the pantry, shouting at the top of her lungs, "Emma, run!" The next few seconds were chaos. The knife struck the gunman in the shoulder, causing him to stumble backward and release his hold on Emma. The teenager scrambled away from her captor, screaming. The two men near Mrs. Chen lunged forward, but she had already reached the pantry and was frantically feeling along the back panel for the hidden release. Behind her, she could hear gunshots, shouting, and the sound of furniture being overturned as the kitchen became a battlefield. Her fingers found the mechanism Sarah had described just as someone grabbed her ankle, trying to drag her back into the kitchen. The panel swung inward, revealing a narrow tunnel beyond, dimly lit by emergency lighting that must have been installed as part of David Morrison's security system. "Emma!" Mrs. Chen shouted. "This way!" She could see the teenager crawling across the kitchen floor, trying to avoid the violence erupting around her. From upstairs came the sound of sirens. Jake had reached help. Police were coming. But whether they would arrive in time to save Emma and Tommy was another question entirely. Mrs. Chen pulled herself into the tunnel and turned back to help Emma reach the hidden entrance. Behind them, the Morrison family home was being torn apart by violence and gunfire, as 15 years of secrets finally exploded into the open. And somewhere above it all, Sarah Morrison's voice continued to call out instructions and encouragement, a mother fighting for her children's lives from her prison in the attic, using the very house that had confined her to help them escape the men who had stolen 15 years of her life and were now trying to steal her children's futures as well. The escape tunnel stretched ahead of Mrs. Chen and Emma like a lifeline carved through the earth, its emergency lighting casting eerie shadows on walls that had been hidden from the world for 15 years. The air was thick with the musty scent of disuse and the metallic tang of old pipes, but to Mrs. Chen it smelled like salvation. Behind them, the sounds of chaos in the Morrison house grew muffled, but not silent, a constant reminder that their lives still hung in the balance. Emma crawled close behind her, the teenager's breathing ragged with fear, but her movements determined as she followed the woman who had protected her family for 2 decades into the darkness. The tunnel system was more elaborate than Sarah's hasty description had suggested. Mrs. Chen realized as they moved deeper into the hidden passageways that David Morrison had invested significant time and money into creating multiple escape routes from his house. This wasn't just a simple connection to the storm drains. This was a sophisticated network designed by someone who knew that his criminal activities might someday require a fast, undetectable exit. The walls were reinforced concrete, the lighting was hardwired into the house's electrical system, and there were even ventilation shafts to ensure breathable air during extended use. "Mrs. Chen," Emma whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "How did my mom know about all this? If she's been locked in the attic all these years, how does she know more about the house than we do?" It was a question that had been nagging at Mrs. Chen as well. Sarah's knowledge of the hidden passages seemed impossibly detailed for someone who had supposedly been confined to a single room for 15 years. "I don't know, sweetheart," she replied honestly. "But right now, I'm just grateful she does know. We can ask questions once we're all safe." They had been crawling through the tunnel for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes when they reached an intersection. The main passage continued straight ahead, presumably toward the storm drain system Sarah had mentioned, but there was also a narrower branch that curved upward at a sharp angle. Mrs. Chen paused, trying to decide which route would get them to safety fastest. From somewhere above, she could hear the sound of heavy footsteps and shouting voices. The police had definitely arrived, but so had more of Morrison's associates. The house was becoming a battlefield, and Tommy was still trapped in the middle of it. "We have to go back," Emma said suddenly, her voice firm despite the tremor of fear beneath it. "We can't leave Tommy up there with those men." Mrs. Chen turned to look at the teenager, seeing not the frightened child who had been held at gunpoint just minutes earlier, but a young woman who was willing to risk her own safety for her little brother. "Emma, it's too dangerous. The police are there now. They'll get Tommy out." But even as she said the words, Miss Chen knew they might not be true. The men who had invaded the Morrison house were professional killers. They wouldn't hesitate to use an 8-year-old boy as a human shield if it meant avoiding capture. The decision was made for them when they heard Sarah's voice echoing through the tunnel system, carried by the same ventilation shafts that provided air circulation. Her words were faint but clear enough to understand, and what she was saying made Mrs. Chen's blood run cold. "Tommy, honey, I need you to be very brave. The bad men are coming up to the attic, and we need to hide in the special room. Remember what I told you about staying quiet no matter what you hear." Mrs. Chen looked at Emma and saw her own determination reflected in the teenager's face. They weren't going to abandon Tommy and Sarah to face those killers alone. "There has to be another way into the attic from down here," she said, studying the upward sloping branch of the tunnel. "Your father wouldn't have created an escape route that only went in one direction." Emma nodded, understanding immediately. "If we can get back into the house without those men seeing us, maybe we can help Mom and Tommy get out." They changed direction, following the narrower passage as it climbed steadily upward through the walls of the house. The emergency lighting was sparser here, and they had to feel their way along sections of complete darkness. Mrs. Chen could hear Emma's breathing becoming more labored as they climbed, and she realized the teenager was fighting off a panic attack. "Just breathe, sweetheart," she whispered. "In and out, nice and steady. We're going to get through this." The passage ended at what appeared to be a blank wall, but Mrs. Chen could feel air movement around the edges of what must be another hidden panel. She pressed against different sections of the wall until she found the release mechanism, and the panel swung inward to reveal the interior of a closet. Through the slats of the closet door, she could see into what looked like Mr. Morrison's home office. The room was dark and appeared to be empty, but she could hear voices and movement from other parts of the house. Mrs. Chen eased the closet door open and peered out. The office was indeed empty, but she could see flashing red and blue lights through the windows, indicating a significant police presence outside. From upstairs came the sound of heavy footsteps and muffled shouting. Someone was definitely searching the second floor, probably looking for the children. From the attic, she could still hear Sarah's voice, though her words were no longer clear enough to understand from this distance. "We need to get upstairs," Emma whispered. "But how do we get past the police and those men without getting caught?" Mrs. Chen studied the layout of the office, looking for anything that might give them an advantage. That's when she noticed that the ceiling had an access panel for the house's HVAC system. The ductwork might provide another hidden route through the house, allowing them to reach the attic without using the stairs or hallways where they might be spotted. She pointed up at the ceiling panel. "Can you climb?" Emma nodded, though Mrs. Chen could see the fear in her eyes. They were about to venture deeper into danger rather than fleeing to safety, and both of them knew it. But neither of them could live with themselves if they abandoned Tommy and Sarah when there might still be a chance to save them. Mrs. Chen dragged Mr. Morrison's desk chair over to the wall beneath the access panel and climbed up to examine the opening. The panel was held in place by simple clips and came away easily when she applied pressure to the right spots. Beyond it was a rectangular opening leading into the house's main air duct system. The space was cramped, barely large enough for an adult to crawl through, but it appeared to extend throughout the house. "This is going to be tight," she warned Emma, "and we don't know where it leads, but it might be our only chance to reach them without being seen." Emma nodded grimly. "Mom and Tommy need us. Let's go." Mrs. Chen boosted the teenager up into the ductwork, then pulled herself up after her. The metal was cold against their skin, and every movement seemed to echo loudly in the confined space. But at least they were moving toward the family members who needed their help. As they crawled through the darkness above the Morrison house, guided only by faint light filtering through other vent openings, Mrs. Chen reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in the space of a few hours. This morning, her biggest concern had been whether Tommy would finish his homework. Now she was crawling through air ducts in a desperate attempt to save 3 members of the family she loved from professional killers who had been hiding in plain sight for 20 years. But as they moved deeper into the house's hidden infrastructure, Mrs. Chen realized that this night was about more than just survival. It was about finally confronting the lies and secrets that had poisoned the Morrison family for 15 years. Sarah Morrison was alive, and she was fighting for her children from her prison in the attic. David Morrison's criminal activities were finally being exposed, and 3 innocent children were getting a chance to learn the truth about their family, no matter how painful that truth might be. The ductwork eventually brought them to a vertical shaft that Mrs. Chen recognized as the main air return for the house's heating system. Looking up through the darkness, she could see a faint rectangle of light that had to be an opening into the attic space. They had found their way to Sarah and Tommy. Now they just had to figure out how to get them all out alive. The vertical shaft that led to the attic access point was narrower than Mrs. Chen had hoped, barely wide enough for an adult to squeeze through, but it was their only chance to reach Sarah and Tommy without using the main staircase where they would certainly be spotted by the armed men searching the house. She could hear Emma breathing heavily behind her, the teenager's fear and exhaustion evident in every strained breath, but her determination never wavered. Above them, faint light filtered down through what had to be a vent opening into the attic space, and Mrs. Chen could occasionally make out Sarah's voice, still whispering reassurances to Tommy. The climb was treacherous, with no handholds or footholds except the seams where different sections of ductwork had been joined together years earlier. Mrs. Chen's hands were already raw from crawling through the tunnels, and now they were bleeding as she gripped the sharp metal edges and pulled herself upward inch by inch. Behind her, Emma was doing the same, though Mrs. Chen could hear small sounds of pain as the teenager struggled to keep up. They couldn't afford to make noise, couldn't risk alerting the men below to their presence, but every movement seemed to echo through the metal shaft like thunder. Halfway up the vertical section, Mrs. Chen heard voices from directly below them. 2 men were in the hallway beneath the air return shaft, their conversation clearly audible through the thin metal. "The old man says the woman knows where the backup files are hidden," one of them said in a voice Mrs. Chen didn't recognize. 20 years of financial records, client lists, transaction details. If those files get to the authorities, everyone goes down. The second voice was equally unfamiliar. So we find the files, eliminate the witnesses, and torch the house. Make it look like a gas leak explosion. No bodies to identify, no evidence to analyze. Mrs. Chen felt sick to her stomach. These men weren't just planning to kill the Morrison family to cover up David's money laundering activities. They were planning to destroy any evidence that could implicate their entire criminal organization. Sarah's knowledge of the hidden files made her even more dangerous to them than her knowledge of David's illegal activities. And now Mrs. Chen and Emma had heard their plans as well, making them targets for elimination. She forced herself to keep climbing, knowing that stopping to process the horror of what she had overheard would only waste precious time. Above her, the light from the attic access point was getting brighter, and she could now clearly hear Sarah's voice speaking to Tommy. I know you're scared, sweetheart, but I need you to be very quiet now. Some bad men are coming up the stairs, and we have to hide until the police can help us. Tommy's response was barely audible, but Mrs. Chen could make out the words. The lady who takes care of us is coming to help. I can hear her in the walls. The child's faith in her was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Mrs. Chen had spent 20 years caring for this family, protecting these children, earning their trust and love. Now she was literally risking her life to keep that trust, crawling through air ducts and preparing to face armed killers to save 3 people who had become more important to her than her own safety. She reached the access point and carefully pushed against the vent cover, relieved when it moved easily. The cover had been designed to be removable from either side, probably another feature of David Morrison's elaborate security system. Mrs. Chen pulled herself through the opening and found herself in a section of the attic she had never seen before, despite having been in the house for 20 years. This area was clearly separate from the main attic space where Sarah had been imprisoned, accessed through the hidden passages rather than the locked door she had always known about. The space was larger than she had expected, with proper flooring, electrical lighting, and what appeared to be a sophisticated ventilation system. It looked like a safe room designed to house people for extended periods if necessary. Emma emerged from the vent behind her, looking around in amazement at the elaborate setup. Dad really was paranoid about security, she whispered. This looks like something from a spy movie. Mrs. Chen nodded, but her attention was focused on finding Sarah and Tommy. She could hear voices coming from deeper in the attic, behind a partition wall that had been constructed to divide the space into separate areas. Moving carefully to avoid making noise on the wooden flooring, she approached the partition and found a doorway that had been left partially open. Through the gap, she could see into Sarah Morrison's prison. The space was larger than she had imagined from Sarah's descriptions, but it was clearly designed for long-term confinement rather than comfort. There was a small bed, a table and chair, shelves lined with books and personal items, and even a tiny kitchenette with a mini refrigerator and microwave. But there were no windows, no natural light, no connection to the outside world except for the ventilation system and whatever communication David Morrison had allowed over the years. Sarah was sitting on the bed with Tommy, both of them facing away from the doorway, looking toward the main attic access door that Mrs. Chen knew led to the locked entrance from the hallway. They were waiting for the armed men to break through that door, having no idea that rescue was approaching from behind them. Mrs. Chen stepped into the room and both Sarah and Tommy turned at the sound of her footsteps. The expression of relief and gratitude on Sarah's face was something Mrs. Chen would remember for the rest of her life. Margaret, Sarah whispered, standing and moving toward her with Tommy still in her arms. I knew you would find a way. I knew you wouldn't abandon us. Up close, Mrs. Chen could see the toll that 15 years of imprisonment had taken on the woman she had believed was dead. Sarah looked older than her 43 years, her hair streaked with premature gray, her skin pale from lack of sunlight. But her eyes were still bright with intelligence and determination, and her love for her children was evident in every gesture. Emma appeared in the doorway behind Mrs. Chen, and Sarah's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. She set Tommy down and rushed to embrace her daughter, both women crying as they held each other after 15 years of separation. My baby girl, Sarah sobbed. Look how beautiful you've become. I've missed so much of your life, but I've thought about you every single day. Emma was crying too hard to speak, clinging to the mother she had mourned for half her life. The reunion was interrupted by the sound of splintering wood from somewhere beyond the partition wall. The men had found the main attic access door and were breaking through the lock. "We have to go right now," Mrs. Chen said urgently. "I know a way out, but we have to move fast." Sarah grabbed a small bag from beside her bed, and Mrs. Chen realized she had been prepared for this moment for years, ready to flee at a moment's notice if the opportunity ever arose. They moved quickly back through the safe room area toward the vent opening Mrs. Chen and Emma had used to enter the attic. But as they reached the access point, they could hear voices coming from the ductwork below them. The men had discovered the tunnel system and were following their trail. The escape route that had brought them into the attic was now blocked by armed killers coming up from below. "There has to be another way out," Mrs. Chen said, looking around the safe room desperately. "Your husband wouldn't have built all this without multiple exit strategies." Sarah nodded, moving to what appeared to be a blank section of wall. She pressed against a specific point, and a hidden panel swung inward to reveal another passage. "This leads to the roof," she said. "David showed it to me once, years ago, before everything went wrong. But it's a long drop to the ground, and there might not be anything to help us climb down." From behind them came the sound of the vent cover being pushed aside as someone climbed up from the ductwork. They were out of time for careful planning. Mrs. Chen grabbed Tommy's hand while Emma stayed close to her father, and they followed Sarah into the narrow passage that led upward toward the roof. Behind them, she could hear men's voices in the safe room, calling out to each other as they searched for their escaped prisoners. The passage was steep and cramped, clearly designed for emergency use rather than comfort. After what felt like an eternity of climbing, they reached another access panel, this one leading to the outside. Sarah pushed it open, and cool October air rushed in, carrying with it the sounds of sirens, shouting voices, and the general chaos of a major police operation. They were on the roof of the Morrison house, 3 stories above the ground, with armed killers pursuing them from below, and no clear way to reach safety. But as Mrs. Chen looked out over the neighborhood she had known for 20 years, she could see that help had indeed arrived. Police cars filled the street, officers were positioned around the perimeter of the house, and she could even see what looked like a SWAT team preparing to enter the building. Jake had done exactly what she had told him to do. He had escaped and brought help. Now she just had to figure out how to get the rest of the family down from the roof before their pursuers caught up with them. The sound of footsteps in the passage behind them indicated that they had been found. In a few seconds, armed men would emerge onto the roof, and the Morrison family's long nightmare would either end in rescue or in tragedy. But for the first time since this impossible night had begun, Mrs. Chen felt a flicker of hope. They were all together now, the family she had devoted her life to protecting. And after 20 years of lies and secrets, the truth was finally coming to light. As Emma, Mrs. Chen, and Tommy crawled into the vast, dust-choked attic through the cramped ventilation shaft, the full horror and magnitude of the hidden room revealed itself. Weak moonlight filtered in through dirty panes, glinting off broken mirrors and forgotten trunks stacked against warped walls, throwing monstrous shadows that seemed to flicker with every creak of the old house. The air was so heavy with mold and the breath of decades that every inhalation tasted of sorrow and neglect. Sheets draped over disintegrating furniture rustled in the draft, while piles of faded photographs lay scattered, faces blurred and eyes staring from a lost era. Against one crumbling wall, the remnants of a child's room stood as a cruel monument to stolen innocence. Battered toys lurking in cobwebs, a threadbare teddy bear missing a limb, and a canopy bed, its once proud lace now tattered and yellowed with time. There was a doll, half its porcelain face broken, forgotten atop a splintered chest where its owner had probably whispered secrets long ago. The dull echo of distant sirens and crackling radios outside only underscored that the world around them was closing in. In the center of this prison sat a spectral figure, the woman whose presence haunted every corner of the Morrison home. Thin arms wrapped around bony knees, she was wrapped in rags. Her hair was a matted veil, shadowing eyes hollowed by captivity and despair. Mrs. Chen stepped cautiously forward, feeling the floorboards flex underfoot, each step measured, not for fear of the woman, but out of reverence for the magnitude of her suffering. Her trembling hands settled atop the broken doll as if to claim an anchor amid the chaos. A rustle drew their eyes. The woman's face turned slowly toward them. Illuminated in a shaft of lunar glow, her features were both unfamiliar and heartbreakingly familiar. I, I'm Elizabeth, she rasped, her voice the brittle remnant of countless nightmares. Emma moved, overcome by tears, dropping her flashlight and reaching for the frail hand that had once comforted her in infancy. Mom, she whispered, her voice both fragile and fierce, hope and grief finally colliding in the gloom. Outside in the gardens and side streets, neighbors and police swept the perimeter with steady beams of light and quiet urgency. The house itself, tense and expectant as a held breath, waited for whatever final act fate had written. Somewhere below, the cacophony of raised voices, gunshots, and splintering wood foretold that time was running out for the escape. Elizabeth, steadying herself on the edge of her ruined bed, lifted her chin with a survivor's resolve. She pulled forth a faded map, drawn on the back of an old letter, a plan she had crafted silently through years of confinement. There's one last way out, but you must trust me, she whispered, gaze burning with determination that belied her weakened form. Mrs. Chen knelt, checking the hidden passage's entrance beneath loose floorboards, her hands moving with both fear and conviction as she verified the escape route's safety. Emma helped Tommy climb down, gently soothing his sobs, as the family, once lost, joined hands and prepared to descend into darkness. The sirens outside swelled as dawn threatened to spill across the rooftops, a fragile promise of hope beyond the night of terror. As the first shafts of morning light pierced the clouds, the battle for freedom turned from desperate flight to daring rescue. The attic, guardian of secrets and silent suffering, finally began to yield its survivors to the world outside. The night was heavy with danger and desperation when Emma, Mrs. Chen, and Tommy finally emerged from the cramped ventilation shaft into the vast, shadow-filled attic that had harbored the Morrison family's darkest secret for 20 years. The moonlight, filtering weakly through decades of grime-coated window panes, cast eerie silver beams that illuminated a space frozen in time and suffering. Dust particles danced languidly through the stagnant air, disturbed by their arrival into this forgotten realm where truth had been imprisoned alongside an innocent woman. The attic was a macabre museum of stolen childhood. Toys lay scattered and buried under thick layers of dust, their bright colors muted by years of neglect. A porcelain doll, its face cracked and missing one glass eye, stared blindly from beside an overturned toy chest. In the corner stood a small canopy bed, its once white lace curtains now yellowed and tattered, hanging like ghostly remnants of innocence that had been systematically destroyed. Books with warped pages and water stains were piled against the walls, and clothing hung limply from makeshift lines strung between the exposed wooden beams. At the center of this heartbreaking tableau sat Elizabeth, the woman who had once been Sarah Morrison, wife and mother, now a living ghost who had endured 15 years of captivity in her own home. Her fragile frame was wrapped in layers of threadbare linens and worn blankets, her once beautiful blonde hair now streaked with premature gray and hanging in tangled strands around a face that bore the unmistakable marks of prolonged suffering. Her skin was pale as parchment from years without sunlight, and her hands, once smooth and gentle, were now thin and marked with small scars from her attempts to maintain some semblance of normalcy in her prison. But her eyes, deep blue eyes that Emma recognized from faded family photographs, still burned with an unextinguished flame of hope and maternal love. When she looked up at her daughter, those eyes filled with tears that had been held back for 15 long years. "My beautiful Emma," she whispered, her voice hoarse from years of silence, broken only by conversations with Tommy during his brief visits to her hidden world. "Look how you've grown. You look just like I did when I was your age." Emma collapsed to her knees, her teenage composure shattered completely as she crawled across the dusty floor to embrace the mother she had mourned, grieved for, and missed every single day of her life since she was an infant. The reunion was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Two hearts that had been torn apart by violence and deception finally finding each other again in the most unlikely of circumstances. Mother and daughter held each other, both crying, both trying to compress 15 years of separation into a single, precious moment of connection. Mrs. Chen, witnessing this reunion after 20 years of caring for a family she had never fully understood, felt her own eyes fill with tears. She had devoted her life to protecting these children. never knowing that their mother had been just above their heads all this time, listening to their laughter, their tears, their growth into young adults, powerless to comfort or guide them. The cruel irony of it all was almost too much to bear. "Sarah," she said softly, using the name she remembered from happier times. "I'm so sorry. If I had known, if I had suspected—" "You couldn't have known," Sarah replied, lifting one hand from Emma's trembling shoulders to reach toward Mrs. Chen. "David was very careful to make sure no one would ever suspect. And Margaret, you've done something I never could. You've kept my children safe. You've loved them and protected them and given them the stability I was unable to provide. I can never thank you enough for that." Tommy, overwhelmed by the emotional intensity of the reunion and still frightened by the sounds of violence echoing from below, pressed himself against Mrs. Chen's side. The 8-year-old's world had been completely turned upside down in the span of a few hours, and he was struggling to process the magnitude of what was happening around him. "Mrs. Chen," he whispered, "is that really Emma and Jake's mom? The one who died in the car accident?" Mrs. Chen knelt down to his level, her voice gentle but firm. "Yes, sweetheart, but she didn't die in a car accident. She's been trapped up here all this time, and now we're going in to help her get free." Outside the attic windows, the night was alive with activity. Police officers and emergency responders had surrounded the Morrison house, their vehicles creating a perimeter of flashing red and blue lights that painted the suburban neighborhood in urgent, otherworldly colors. Neighbors had emerged from their homes despite the late hour, standing in small groups on sidewalks and lawns, whispering among themselves about the unthinkable events unfolding in the house they had always considered a model of suburban normalcy. Search teams with flashlights and K9 units, were systematically combing the surrounding woods, looking for any sign of the missing family members or evidence of what had really happened during this impossible night. The sounds of their rescue efforts filtered up through the walls and floors of the house, voices calling out through megaphones, radio chatter crackling between units, the steady rhythm of boots on pavement as officers took their positions. It was the sound of hope, the sound of a community rallying to save people they cared about, the sound of justice finally catching up with criminals who had operated in shadows for far too long. But it was also the sound of time running out, because somewhere in the house below, armed men were searching for the very people that the police were trying to save. Inside the house, chaos reigned as Mr. Morrison's criminal associates realized that their carefully planned operation was falling apart. The sounds of splintering wood and shattering glass echoed through the building as they broke down doors and searched every room, becoming increasingly desperate as they failed to locate their targets. Their voices, harsh with anger and fear, could be heard shouting commands to each other, coordinating their search while simultaneously preparing for the inevitable confrontation with law enforcement. These were professional killers who knew that capture meant life in prison or death, and they were not going to surrender without a fight. "We have to move now," Sarah said urgently, struggling to stand on legs that had grown weak from years of confinement. "They're going to find the entrance to this space eventually, and when they do, we'll be trapped with no way out." She moved to a section of the attic wall that looked identical to every other section, but when she pressed against a specific spot, a hidden panel swung inward to reveal another passage. This one was different from the ventilation shaft they had used to reach the attic. It was wider with proper lighting and what appeared to be a ventilation system designed for human use. Mrs. Chen realized that the Morrison house was far more complex than anyone had ever suspected. David Morrison hadn't just created a prison for his wife. He had built an elaborate network of hidden passages, safe rooms, and escape routes that would allow him to disappear at a moment's notice if his criminal activities were ever discovered. The house was like an iceberg, with a normal family home that everyone could see representing only a small fraction of the true structure that lay hidden beneath and within the walls. "This leads to an exit in the basement," Sarah explained as she guided Emma and Tommy toward the hidden passage. "David showed me the layout years ago before everything went wrong. If we can reach the basement, there's a tunnel that connects to the storm drain system 3 blocks away. We can get out without the police or David's men ever knowing which direction we went." The plan was dangerous, requiring them to move through the house while armed men were actively searching for them, but it was their best chance at survival. Mrs. Chen looked back at the attic space where Sarah had spent 15 years of her life, at the makeshift bed where she had slept, at the small table where she had eaten countless lonely meals, at the pile of books she had read over and over again to maintain her sanity. It was both a prison and a testament to human endurance, a place where a woman had somehow maintained her hope and her love for her children, despite being cut off from the world and everyone she cared about. "We'll come back for your things," she promised. "Once this is all over, once it's safe, we'll come back." Sarah shook her head, taking one last look around the space that had defined her existence for so many years. "There's nothing here I need to keep," she said firmly. "My children are all I ever wanted. Everything else can stay buried with the lies that put me here." With that, she stepped into the hidden passage, followed by Emma, Tommy, and Mrs. Chen. Behind them, the attic that had held the Morrison family's darkest secret for 20 years was left empty, its shadows finally ready to give up their prisoner. As they moved through David Morrison's elaborate hidden infrastructure, navigating passages that had been built to help a criminal escape justice, Mrs. Chen reflected on how much her life had changed in the span of a single evening. This morning, her biggest concern had been whether Tommy would finish his homework on time. Now she was helping a family escape from professional killers while the police surrounded the house where she had worked for 20 years. But despite the danger and the chaos and the complete upheaval of everything she had believed about the Morrison family, Mrs. Chen felt a sense of rightness about what they were doing. For the first time in 20 years, the family was truly together. For the first time since Sarah's disappearance, the children had their real mother back. And for the first time since David Morrison had made his deal with criminals, the truth was finally coming to light. The hidden passage led them deeper into the house's secret infrastructure, toward an uncertain but hopeful future where lies could no longer poison a family's love, and where 20 years of separation could finally begin to heal. The hidden passage stretched before them like a concrete artery, its walls sweating with condensation and decades of secrets. Mrs. Chen moved cautiously forward, her flashlight beam dancing across the narrow corridor that David Morrison had constructed as his ultimate escape route. Behind her, Sarah supported Emma's weight as the teenager struggled with exhaustion and the emotional trauma of the reunion, while Tommy gripped Mrs. Chen's free hand with the desperate strength of a child who had seen too much in one terrible night. The passage was more sophisticated than the ventilation system they had used to reach the attic. This was clearly designed for human travel during emergencies, with proper flooring, adequate height for adults, and even small alcoves built into the walls where supplies could be stored. Emergency lighting ran along the ceiling, activated by motion sensors as they passed, illuminating their way while simultaneously announcing their presence to anyone who might be monitoring the system. Mrs. Chen realized that David Morrison's paranoia had led him to create not just a prison for his wife, but an entire shadow infrastructure within and beneath his suburban home. "How long is this passage?" Mrs. Chen asked Sarah quietly, trying not to let her voice carry too far in the confined space. The acoustics were strange here, with sounds seeming to bounce and echo in unpredictable ways. She was acutely aware that they might not be alone in these tunnels, that David Morrison or his associates might know about this escape route and could be waiting for them somewhere ahead. "About 300 yards, Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It connects to the storm drain system near Miller Park. David showed me the blueprints once, years ago, when he was still trying to convince me that his criminal activities were just temporary business arrangements. He said he wanted me to know how to get the children out safely if anything ever happened to him." The bitter irony in her voice was unmistakable. The escape route designed to protect his family had instead become their salvation from the man who had destroyed their lives. Emma stumbled slightly, and Mrs. Chen realized the teenager was operating on pure adrenaline and willpower. She had been through more trauma in one night than most people experienced in a lifetime. Discovering that her supposedly dead mother was alive, being held at gunpoint by professional killers, crawling through ventilation systems, and now fleeing through underground tunnels. It was too much for anyone to process, let alone a 15-year-old. "Emma, do you need to rest for a moment?" Mrs. Chen asked gently. "I'm okay," Emma said, though her voice shook with exhaustion. "I just want to get out of here. I want to get Mom somewhere safe." The teenager's determination was remarkable, But Mrs. Chen could see that she was pushing herself beyond her limits. They needed to reach safety soon, before Emma's strength gave out completely. Tommy had grown quiet, no longer asking questions or making observations about their surroundings. The 8-year-old was simply following where the adults led, trusting them to keep him safe in a situation that was far beyond his ability to understand. Mrs. Chen squeezed his hand reassuringly, and he looked up at her with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone his age. The events of this night would stay with him for the rest of his life, she knew. But at least he would have a chance to grow up, to process what had happened, to heal from the trauma with the help of people who loved him. The passage began to slope downward more steeply, and Mrs. Chen could feel the temperature dropping as they descended deeper underground. The walls were older here, less finished, suggesting that this section connected to pre-existing infrastructure rather than being built specifically for David Morrison's use. She could smell moisture and earth, and occasionally caught glimpses of pipes and electrical conduits running parallel to their route. Behind them, from somewhere in the direction they had come, the sound of voices echoed through the passage. Men's voices, calling to each other, coordinating a search. The killers had found the entrance to the hidden passage system and were following their trail. Mrs. Chen felt her heart rate accelerate as she realized they were being pursued through the very tunnels that were supposed to represent their salvation. "They're behind us," she said quietly to Sarah. "How much farther to the exit?" Sarah's face went pale in the dim light from the emergency fixtures. "Maybe another 100 yards, but there's a problem. The exit is secured with an electronic lock that requires a key code. David never told me what the code was." Mrs. Chen felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. They were trapped in a tunnel system with armed killers pursuing them, heading toward an exit they might not be able to open. But Tommy surprised them all by speaking up. "I know the code," he said quietly. "When I was in the attic with the lady, she told me lots of things about the house. She said the code was my birthday, month, day, year. She said my dad programmed it that way because he wanted to remember that some things were more important than his business." Sarah looked down at her youngest child with amazement and pride. Even in her prison, even cut off from her children's lives, she had found ways to protect them and prepare them for the possibility of escape. The voices behind them were getting closer, and Mrs. Chen could now hear the sound of running footsteps on the concrete floor. Their pursuers were moving fast, probably using night vision equipment or more powerful flashlights than the single beam Mrs. Chen carried. "We need to run," she said urgently. "Everyone stay together, but we need to move as fast as we can." They broke into a run, their footsteps echoing loudly in the narrow space. Mrs. Chen held Tommy's hand tightly, making sure the child could keep up with their pace while not allowing him to fall behind. Behind them, Sarah was supporting Emma, both women pushing themselves to their physical limits in their desperate flight toward freedom. The passage seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of them, and Mrs. Chen began to worry that they had missed a turn or taken a wrong route. Then suddenly they reached a heavy steel door with an electronic keypad mounted beside it. Beyond the door, Mrs. Chen could hear the sound of running water, which had to be the storm drain system Sarah had described. Freedom was just on the other side of this barrier, if Tommy's information about the key code was correct. Tommy stepped forward to the keypad, his small fingers surprisingly steady as he entered the numbers. 08282011. His 8th birthday, the day he had turned 8 just 2 months ago. There was a moment of silence, and then the lock disengaged with a solid click. The door swung open, revealing a concrete tunnel beyond, with a stream of water running down its center. They had reached the storm drain system. The exit to the street level was somewhere ahead of them, probably just a few hundred yards through the drainage tunnel. But as they stepped through the doorway, Mrs. Chen heard the sound of their pursuers getting much closer. The men chasing them were maybe 30 seconds behind, close enough that they would see the open door and know exactly which direction their quarry had gone. "Close the door behind us," Sarah said urgently. "Maybe we can slow them down." But Mrs. Chen shook her head. "If we close it, they'll know we came this way. Leave it open, and maybe they'll think we went further down the passage." It was a desperate gamble, but anything that might confuse their pursuers could buy them precious extra minutes. They waded into the storm drain system, the cold water reaching their ankles as they moved through the concrete tunnel toward what they hoped would be their final escape route. Above them, through storm grates set into the ceiling, Mrs. Chen could see the faint glow of streetlights. They were almost back to the surface world, almost free of the underground maze that had become both their salvation and their trap. But freedom was still not guaranteed. Behind them, the voices of their pursuers were echoing through the tunnels, getting closer with every passing second. And ahead of them, the storm drain system stretched into darkness, with no guarantee that the exit Sarah remembered would still be accessible after all these years. The Morrison family's nightmare was approaching its climax, with freedom tantalizingly close but far from certain. Mrs. Chen gripped Tommy's hand tighter and pressed forward through the cold, running water, praying that their 20-year journey through lies and secrets would finally end in the light of dawn. The storm drain system beneath the Morrison house was a labyrinth of concrete tunnels and rushing water that stretched for miles beneath the suburban neighborhood. Mrs. Chen led the way through the ankle-deep stream, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as she guided Sarah, Emma, and Tommy toward what she hoped would be their final escape from 20 years of lies and violence. The water was shockingly cold, seeping through their shoes and clothing, but it was also cleansing in a way, washing away the dust and terror of the attic prison that had defined their nightmare. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit echoed through the storm drain system with terrifying clarity. The concrete walls amplified every voice, every footstep, every splash as their hunters followed them into the underground maze. Mrs. Chen could hear at least 3 different men coordinating their search, their voices harsh with frustration and desperation as they realized their carefully planned operation was falling apart. These were professional killers who had spent decades avoiding capture, and they understood that being caught now meant life in prison or execution for their crimes. "How much farther?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of running water. The teenager was struggling to keep up, exhaustion and trauma finally catching up with her after hours of adrenaline-fueled escape attempts. Mrs. Chen could see that Emma was operating on willpower alone now, her body pushed far beyond its normal limits. Sarah moved closer to her daughter, wrapping a supportive arm around Emma's waist to help her maintain her balance on the slippery concrete floor of the drain. "Not much farther," Sarah replied, though Mrs. Chen could hear uncertainty in her voice. It had been 15 years since David Morrison had shown his wife the escape route, and the storm drain system might have changed significantly since then. Construction projects, maintenance work, or simple structural deterioration could have blocked passages or created new obstacles that would trap them in the underground maze. They were gambling their lives on information that might no longer be accurate. Tommy had grown quiet again, focusing all his energy on keeping up with the adults as they moved through the cold, flowing water. The 8-year-old's small legs were struggling to maintain the pace, and Mrs. Chen found herself half carrying him as they navigated around debris and obstacles in the tunnel. His silence worried her more than his earlier fear-driven questions. Children shouldn't have to endure what Tommy had experienced tonight, shouldn't have to develop the kind of emotional shutdown mechanisms that allowed them to function during extreme trauma. The storm drain began to branch into multiple smaller channels, and Sarah paused at the junction, studying the different options with a frown of concentration. "I think it's the middle passage," she said finally. "David said the exit was through the main drainage line that runs parallel to Elm Street." But her voice carried doubt, and Mrs. Chen realized that making the wrong choice here could lead them deeper into the underground system, farther from safety and closer to the men who were hunting them. They chose the middle passage and pressed forward through water that was gradually getting deeper. Mrs. Chen noticed that the walls here were older, built of brick rather than the concrete they had encountered earlier. This section of the drain system probably dated back to the original construction of the neighborhood in the 1950s, when the Morrison house and its neighbors were first built on land that had previously been farmland and forest. The bricks were covered with decades of mineral deposits and algae, creating a slippery surface that made walking treacherous. "I can see light ahead," Sarah said suddenly, pointing toward a faint glow that was barely visible in the distance. The light was different from the artificial illumination they had been following in the passage. This had the pale, natural quality of dawn breaking above ground. They were approaching a connection to the surface world, an exit from the underground prison that had nearly become their tomb. But as they moved toward the light, the sound of their pursuers grew louder behind them. The men chasing them had also reached the junction and were systematically searching each branch of the storm drain system. Mrs. Chen could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their search with military precision. These weren't random criminals stumbling around in the dark. They were experienced professionals who knew how to track targets through difficult terrain. The light ahead was coming from a storm grate set into the street level, and Mrs. Chen could see that there was a metal ladder built into the wall beneath it. But as they approached, she realized there was a problem. The grate was secured with a heavy padlock, preventing access from below. They had reached the exit, but they couldn't get out without somehow breaking or removing the lock that kept them trapped underground. "Stand back," Sarah said firmly, surprising everyone with the steel in her voice. She had found a heavy piece of concrete debris, probably from some long-ago construction project, and was preparing to use it as a battering ram against the padlock. 15 years, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. 15 years I've been waiting for this moment. No lock is going to stop me from reaching my children's freedom. She swung the concrete with all the strength that 15 years of rage and determination could provide. The impact rang through the storm drain like a gunshot, and Mrs. Chen worried that the sound would draw their pursuers directly to them. But the padlock held, its metal only slightly dented by the assault. Sarah drew back to swing again, and this time Emma and Mrs. Chen added their strength to hers, all three women attacking the lock with desperate fury. On the fourth strike, something gave way. Not the padlock itself, but the metal hasp that secured it to the grate. Years of moisture and corrosion had weakened the connection, and their combined assault finally broke it free. The grate swung open, revealing the pre-dawn street above, and Mrs. Chen had never seen anything more beautiful than that rectangle of gray sky framed by the storm drain opening. Tommy went up the ladder first, his small size making him the easiest to lift through the narrow opening. Then Emma, supported by her mother and Mrs. Chen, as she climbed on exhausted legs toward the surface. Sarah followed, moving with the determination of a woman who had dreamed of this moment for 15 years. Finally, Mrs. Chen climbed the ladder herself, emerging from the underground maze into the cool October morning air. They were on Elm Street, 3 blocks from the Morrison house, surrounded by the familiar suburban landscape that Mrs. Chen had known for 20 years. But everything looked different now, seen through eyes that had witnessed the truth behind the neighborhood's carefully maintained facade. Police cars filled the street, their red and blue lights painting the dawn sky in urgent colors. Officers and emergency responders were everywhere, coordinating rescue efforts and processing the crime scene that the Morrison house had become. A police officer noticed them emerging from the storm drain and immediately called for medical assistance. Within minutes, they were surrounded by paramedics, social workers, and investigators, all trying to understand what had happened and ensure that the family received the care they needed after their ordeal. Mrs. Chen found herself being wrapped in a blanket and guided toward an ambulance. But she kept looking back at the storm drain opening, knowing that their pursuers were still down there, still dangerous, still capable of escaping to threaten other innocent families. "There are armed men in the tunnels," she told the first police officer who would listen to her. "Professional killers. They're probably looking for another way out right now." The officer immediately radioed for backup, and within minutes, Mrs. Chen could see tactical teams preparing to enter the storm drain system. The hunters had become the hunted, trapped in the same underground maze they had used to pursue their victims. As the sun rose over the suburban neighborhood, casting long shadows across lawns and sidewalks that looked deceptively normal, Mrs. Chen reflected on how much had changed in the span of a single night. This morning, her biggest concern had been whether Tommy would finish his homework. Now she was a key witness in a case involving kidnapping, imprisonment, money laundering, and attempted murder. The Morrison family's 20-year nightmare was finally ending, but the process of healing and recovery was just beginning. Sarah Morrison sat in the back of an ambulance, holding both of her children close for the first time in 15 years. The reunion that Mrs. Chen witnessed was both beautiful and heartbreaking, a testament to the power of love to survive even the most impossible circumstances. Emma and Jake, who had been found safe at a neighbor's house after his dramatic escape, clung to their mother as if they were afraid she might disappear again if they let go. Tommy, exhausted but safe, fell asleep in Sarah's arms, finally able to rest without fear for the first time since his accidental discovery of the hidden room had set the night's events in motion. The Morrison house stood silent in the morning light, its windows dark and its secrets finally exposed. Crime scene investigators were methodically documenting 20 years of evidence, while structural engineers examined the elaborate network of hidden passages and rooms that David Morrison had constructed to support his criminal activities. The house that had been a symbol of suburban prosperity was revealed as something much darker, a fortress built to protect lies and a prison designed to hide the truth. But the family had survived. Despite everything that had been done to them, despite 20 years of separation and deception and violence, they had found each other again. The truth had finally come to light, and justice would finally be served. As Mrs. Chen watched Sarah Morrison hold her children in the growing daylight, she knew that this was what she had been protecting for 20 years. Not just the safety of individual children, but the possibility of redemption, the chance for love to triumph over evil, and the hope that even the darkest secrets could eventually be brought into the light. The babysitter who had watched the same house for 20 years had finally discovered what she had really been guarding. Not just a family's privacy, but their very survival. And in the end, that was enough. The days following the harrowing escape stretched into weeks that felt both endless and impossibly brief. The Morrison family found themselves at the center of a media storm that transformed their quiet suburban neighborhood into a circus of satellite trucks, news crews, and curious onlookers who came to stare at the house where the impossible had happened. Mrs. Chen watched from her hospital room window as reporters stood in front of the Morrison house, struggling to find words that could adequately convey the scope of the horror that had been hidden behind its ordinary facade for 20 years. Inside the sterile corridors of Millfield General Hospital, the family clung to each other with a desperation born of 15 years of separation and one night of terror that had nearly destroyed them all. Sarah Morrison, the woman who had been presumed dead for half her life, underwent extensive medical evaluations that revealed the physical toll of her imprisonment. Malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, muscle atrophy from lack of exercise, and dental problems from inadequate care painted a clinical picture of systematic neglect and abuse. But the psychological evaluations were even more troubling, revealing layers of trauma, depression, and anxiety that would require years of therapy to address. Emma and Jake struggled with their own psychological wounds, trying to process the revelation that their supposedly dead mother had been alive all along, imprisoned just above their heads while they grew up believing they were orphans. The guilt was overwhelming. How many times had they complained about their lives, wished their father was different, expressed anger at their circumstances, and all while their mother listened helplessly from her prison in the attic. Tommy, at 8 years old, was perhaps the most resilient of the children, but even he showed signs of severe trauma, suffering from nightmares and an inability to sleep unless someone he trusted was physically present in the room. Mrs. Chen found herself serving as a bridge between the family and the outside world, the one person who could speak to reporters, investigators, and social workers, while the Morrison family focused on the overwhelming task of learning to be a family again. She had quit her job at the hardware store. How could she possibly return to sorting paint samples after everything she had experienced? Instead, she appointed herself as the family's unofficial coordinator, helping them navigate the complex web of legal proceedings, medical appointments, and therapy sessions that would define their new reality. The investigation into David Morrison's criminal empire expanded far beyond anyone's initial expectations. Federal agents from multiple agencies descended on the house, carefully documenting the elaborate network of hidden passages, secret rooms, and escape routes that had been constructed over 2 decades of criminal activity. The basement revealed a sophisticated money laundering operation with computer equipment, financial records, and communication devices that connected to organized crime families in 3 different states. But it was the discovery of Sarah's prison in the attic that captured the public imagination and sparked nationwide outrage. The small living space, with its makeshift furniture and pathetic attempts at normalcy, became a symbol of how domestic abuse could be hidden in plain sight, how a man could systematically destroy his wife's life while maintaining a facade of suburban respectability. Women's rights organizations seized on the case as the evidence of how easily society could overlook signs of abuse when they occurred behind closed doors in respectable neighborhoods. The trial of David Morrison and his associates became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in the state's history. Morrison himself, once the picture of suburban success, appeared in court as a broken man who seemed to have aged decades in the months since his arrest. His defense attorney attempted to portray him as a man who had gotten in over his head with dangerous criminals, someone who had kept his wife imprisoned to protect her from the very people who were now his co-defendants. But the prosecution painted a different picture. A man who had chosen money and power over love and family, who had been willing to sacrifice his wife's freedom and his children's happiness to maintain his criminal lifestyle. Sarah Morrison's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the trial. Dressed in a simple blue dress that emphasized how fragile she still appeared, she spoke in a clear, steady voice about 15 years of captivity, of listening to her children grow up without her, of the psychological torture of being presumed dead while watching life go on around her. Her words were devastating in their simplicity. I heard my daughter's first heartbreak through the floor. I listened to my son learn to drive. I was there for every important moment of their lives, but I couldn't comfort them, couldn't guide them, couldn't be their mother. David Morrison didn't just imprison my body, he stole 15 years of my life as a parent. Mrs. Chen also testified, describing the 20 years she had spent caring for the Morrison children while never suspecting that their mother was alive just above their heads. Her testimony provided crucial context for understanding how Morrison had managed to maintain his deception for so long, how he had used Mrs. Chen's genuine care for his children to create a facade of normalcy that hid his crimes. When the prosecutor asked her what she would want people to understand about the case, Mrs. Chen's answer was simple. Evil doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it looks like a successful businessman who loves his children. Sometimes it hides behind a normal life in a normal neighborhood. But love is stronger than evil, and truth is stronger than lies. This family survived because they never stopped loving each other, even when they didn't know if that love could be returned. The verdict was unanimous and swift. David Morrison was convicted on all counts, including kidnapping, false imprisonment, money laundering, conspiracy, and multiple counts of racketeering. His sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole was met with applause from the packed courtroom. His associates received sentences ranging from 25 years to life, effectively dismantling a criminal organization that had operated in the shadows for over 2 decades. But the legal victory was only the beginning of the Morrison family's journey toward healing. Sarah enrolled in intensive therapy to address the psychological damage of her imprisonment, while Emma and Jake worked with counselors to process their complex feelings of grief, anger, and guilt. Tommy, with the resilience that children often display in the face of trauma, seemed to adapt more quickly than his older siblings, though his therapist warned that the effects of his experiences might not fully manifest until he was older. The family moved out of the Morrison house, which had been seized by the federal government as part of the criminal forfeiture proceedings. They rented a small apartment across town, a modest space that felt like a palace compared to Sarah's attic prison. For the first time in 15 years, Sarah could walk outside whenever she wanted, could feel sunlight on her face, could make decisions about her own life. The simple act of grocery shopping brought her to tears. The abundance of choices, the freedom to select what she wanted, the ability to pay with money that hadn't been earned through criminal activity. Mrs. Chen remained a central part of their lives, serving not just as a babysitter, but as a surrogate grandmother to the children and a trusted friend to Sarah. She helped the family navigate their new reality, teaching Sarah about changes in technology and society that had occurred during her imprisonment, helping Emma and Jake understand that their anger at their father was normal and justified, and providing Tommy with the stability and routine he needed to feel secure. The media attention gradually faded, as it always does, moving on to newer tragedies and fresher scandals. The Morrison house was eventually demolished, the city council deciding that the site held too many painful memories to ever serve as a family home again. A small park was built on the lot, with a memorial garden dedicated to survivors of domestic violence. The inscription on a simple stone bench read, "In memory of those who suffered in silence, and in honor of those who found their voice." 1 year after their escape from the storm drain system, the Morrison family gathered in their new home for Emma's 16th birthday. It was the first birthday celebration Sarah had been able to attend in 15 years, and the emotion of the moment was overwhelming for all of them. As Emma blew out the candles on her cake, Sarah whispered a prayer of gratitude, not just for being present for this moment, but for all the moments she would be able to share with her children in the years to come. Mrs. Chen watched from the kitchen doorway as the family celebrated, and she reflected on how much their lives had changed since that terrible October night when Tommy had gone missing. The family she had protected for 20 years was finally whole, finally healing, finally free to be themselves without the shadow of lies and violence hanging over them. It had taken a babysitter's love, a mother's endurance, and 3 children's courage to bring the truth to light, but in the end, justice had prevailed. The Morrison family's story became a symbol of hope for other survivors of domestic abuse, proof that even in the darkest circumstances, love could endure and truth could triumph. Sarah began speaking at conferences and support groups, sharing her story to help other women recognize the signs of abuse and find the strength to seek help. Emma and Jake both decided to pursue careers in social work, wanting to help other children who had been affected by family trauma. Tommy, still young but wise beyond his years, often said that he wanted to grow up to be like Mrs. Chen, someone who protects families and helps them stay together. As the seasons changed and the anniversary of their escape approached, the family gathered once again around their dinner table, a simple wooden table in a small apartment, nothing like the grand dining room in the house where they had once lived. But this table represented something more valuable than wealth or status. It represented freedom, truth, and the unbreakable bonds of a family that had survived the unimaginable and emerged stronger on the other side. Mrs. Chen, now officially adopted as Grandma Chen by all 3 Morrison children, looked around the table at the faces she had loved and protected for so many years. They bore the scars of their trauma, Sarah's premature gray hair, Emma's cautious way of scanning rooms for exits, Jake's protective stance when strangers approached the family, Tommy's need to check that all doors were locked before going to bed. But they also bore the marks of healing. Sarah's growing confidence as she rediscovered her own voice, Emma's emerging leadership as she helped other teenage survivors, Jake's determination to use his experience to help others, Tommy's infectious laughter that proved children could find joy even after experiencing unimaginable darkness. The babysitter who had watched the same house for 20 years had discovered what she was really guarding, not just the safety of individual children, but the possibility of redemption, the power of love to survive even the most impossible circumstances, and the hope that truth would eventually triumph over the most carefully constructed lies. In the end, that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. 6 months after their escape from the nightmare that had consumed 20 years of their lives, the Morrison family gathered around a simple wooden dining table in their new apartment for what had become their weekly tradition, Sunday dinner together. The contrast to their previous life could not have been more stark. Where once they had eaten in the grand dining room of the Morrison house, surrounded by expensive furniture purchased with blood money, they now shared meals at a modest table from a thrift store, bought with Sarah Morrison's first honest paycheck in 15 years. The healing process had been neither quick nor easy. Sarah continued to struggle with agoraphobia and anxiety attacks triggered by unexpected sounds or confined spaces. Emma was receiving intensive therapy for the complex grief she felt at discovering her supposedly dead mother had been alive all along, imprisoned just above her head while she grew up believing herself an orphan. Jake grappled with profound anger issues stemming from his relationship with his father, cycling between rage at David Morrison's deceptions and guilt over the love he had once felt for the man who had destroyed their family. Tommy, perhaps most resilient of all, still woke up screaming from nightmares several nights a week, but had begun to trust that the adults in his life would keep him safe. Mrs. Chen had officially moved in with the family, transitioning from babysitter to grandmother figure to the children she had protected for 2 decades. Her role had evolved from caretaker to advocate, helping the family navigate the complex web of legal proceedings, medical appointments, therapy sessions, and media attention that had become their new reality. She had quit her job at the hardware store. How could she possibly return to organizing paint samples after everything she had experienced? And now devoted herself full-time to helping the Morrison family rebuild their lives from the ground up. The investigation into David Morrison's criminal empire had expanded far beyond anyone's initial expectations, revealing a network of corruption that reached into multiple states and involved dozens of co-conspirators. Federal prosecutors had seized millions of dollars in assets, shut down front companies that had been operating for decades, and arrested associates whose crimes ranged from money laundering to human trafficking. The Morrison house itself had been demolished after forensic teams finished documenting every hidden passage and secret room, with the lot converted into a small memorial park dedicated to survivors of domestic violence. Sarah had become an unexpected advocate for other survivors, speaking at conferences and support groups about the reality of long-term captivity and the complex process of reintegrating into society after years of isolation. Her testimony had been instrumental in passing new legislation that strengthened protections for domestic violence victims and increased funding for family reunification programs. Emma had decided to pursue a career in social work, inspired by the therapists who had helped her family heal. Jake was considering law enforcement, wanting to help catch criminals like his father before they could destroy other families. The media attention had been overwhelming at first, with reporters camping outside their apartment building and following them to therapy appointments and grocery stores. But public interest gradually faded, as it always does, moving on to newer tragedies and fresher scandals. The family preferred it that way. They wanted to heal in private, to rediscover who they were as a family without the constant glare of cameras and the endless questions from journalists who could never truly understand the scope of what they had endured. Tonight's dinner conversation focused on happier topics: Emma's upcoming graduation from high school, Jake's acceptance to community college, Tommy's progress in his new school where he was finally making friends who didn't know about his family's tragic history. Sarah shared news about her job at a local nonprofit organization that helped other domestic violence survivors, work that gave her a sense of purpose beyond her own recovery. Mrs. Chen talked about the garden she was planning for their small balcony, wanting to grow vegetables and flowers that would bring beauty and life to their modest home. As they cleared the dishes together, a simple family ritual that had been impossible for 15 years. Sarah paused to look around the small apartment that had become their sanctuary. The walls were covered with new family photographs, pictures taken during the 6 months since their reunion. Sarah's first trip to a grocery store, Emma teaching her mother how to use a smartphone, Jake showing his mother how to drive his used car, Tommy's 8th birthday party where Sarah had been able to blow out candles with him for the first time in his life. These new memories were slowly outnumbering the painful ones, creating a foundation for the family they were choosing to become. Mrs. Chen watched from the kitchen doorway as Sarah helped Tommy with his homework at the dining table, something she had dreamed of doing for 8 years but had been powerless to accomplish from her prison in the attic. The sight never failed to bring tears to Mrs. Chen's eyes, a reminder of how precious and fragile family bonds could be, and how much strength it took to rebuild them after they had been systematically destroyed by someone who should have protected them. The babysitter who had watched the same house for 20 years had discovered what she was really protecting: not just the physical safety of children, but the possibility that love could survive even the most impossible circumstances. That truth could eventually triumph over the most carefully constructed lies, and that families torn apart by violence and deception could find their way back to each other if they never gave up hope. Outside their apartment window, the lights of the city twinkled in the darkness, representing millions of other families living their own stories of joy and sorrow, triumph and tragedy. Some of those families were probably harboring secrets as dark as the ones that had poisoned the Morrison household for 20 years. Others were celebrating simple pleasures like shared meals and homework help and bedtime stories. Mrs. Chen hoped that their story, Sarah's survival, the children's resilience, the truth finally coming to light, would give other families the courage to speak out against abuse, to trust that help was available, to believe that even the darkest situations could have hopeful endings. As the evening wound down and the family prepared for bed, Mrs. Chen reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that October night when Tommy had gone missing. This morning, her biggest concern had been whether the family would be able to afford a vacation next summer. A normal worry for a normal family rebuilding their lives one day at a time. The contrast to that night of terror in the attic and the storm drains was so complete that sometimes it felt like a dream, except for the scars they all carried and the healing work they continued to do. But they were together now. The family she had devoted 20 years to protecting was finally, truly safe. The truth had come to light. Justice had been served. And every day, in small but meaningful ways, they were choosing love over fear, hope over despair, and the future over the past that had nearly destroyed them. The Morrison family's story had become a symbol of resilience, proof that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit could endure and eventually triumph. It was a story about the power of truth to overcome deception, about the strength of love to survive separation, and about the courage it takes to rebuild a life from the ashes of betrayal and violence. Chen turned off the lights in the small apartment and headed to her own room, grateful for the privilege of having witnessed this family's journey from nightmare to recovery, from lies to truth, from separation to reunion. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, therapy appointments, legal meetings, and the ongoing work of healing. But it would also bring new opportunities for joy, connection, and the simple pleasures of being a family. The babysitter who had watched the same house for 20 years had finally discovered what she had really been guarding all along: the unbreakable bonds of love that connect families even across the darkest circumstances, and the hope that no matter how carefully evil tries to hide itself, truth and justice will eventually find a way to shine through. In the months that followed their harrowing escape, the Morrison family discovered that freedom came with its own complex challenges and unexpected revelations. The suburban neighborhood that had once seemed like a perfect sanctuary now buzzed with constant activity as news crews, investigators, and curious onlookers transformed their quiet street into a circus of attention and speculation. The house where Mrs. Chen had worked for 20 years stood empty and haunting, its windows boarded up like closed eyes, while crime scene tape fluttered in the autumn breeze like yellow ribbons marking the end of an era. Sarah Morrison, the woman who had been presumed dead for 15 years, found herself struggling to navigate a world that had changed dramatically during her imprisonment. Technology that seemed magical to her, social customs that had evolved, and even simple things like grocery stores stocked with products she had never seen before created daily challenges that reminded her constantly of the years that had been stolen from her life. The physical effects of her captivity were equally daunting. Muscle atrophy from lack of exercise, vitamin deficiencies from inadequate nutrition, and dental problems from years of neglect painted a clinical picture of systematic abuse that would take months to address. But it was the psychological healing that proved most complex. Sarah experienced severe agoraphobia when faced with open spaces after 15 years in a confined room. Crowds of people, even well-meaning supporters, triggered panic attacks that left her gasping and shaking. Simple sounds like footsteps on wooden floors or keys turning in locks could transport her back to her prison in the attic, where every noise had meant either hope for rescue or fear of further torment. Sleep remained elusive, interrupted by nightmares that blended memories of her captivity with fears about her family's safety. Emma, now 16 and preparing for her junior year of high school, faced her own unique set of challenges as she processed the revelation that her supposedly dead mother had been alive all along. The teenager struggled with complex feelings of grief, anger, and guilt that her therapist described as complicated bereavement, mourning not just for the mother she thought she had lost, but for the 15 years of childhood she had missed having that mother in her life. School became difficult as classmates alternated between treating her like a celebrity and avoiding her entirely, unsure how to interact with someone whose family story had become international news. The guilt was perhaps the most difficult emotion for Emma to process. How many times had she complained about her life to friends, wishing her father was different, expressing anger at their family circumstances, and all while her mother listened helplessly from above? How many nights had her mother heard her crying herself to sleep and been unable to comfort her? The knowledge that Sarah had been present for every important moment of her life, first dates, school performances, arguments with friends, celebrations, and disappointments, but unable to participate created a grief that felt almost too large to contain. Jake, now 18 and facing decisions about college and his future, dealt with his own psychological wounds through anger and withdrawal. He had idolized his father throughout his childhood, seeing David Morrison as a successful businessman who provided well for his family despite the tragic loss of his wife. Learning that the man he had looked up to was not only a criminal, but the person responsible for imprisoning his mother, created an identity crisis that threatened to consume his sense of self-worth. If he was David Morrison's son, what did that say about his own character? Could evil be inherited? Would he grow up to hurt people the way his father had hurt his family? Tommy, at 8 years old, displayed the remarkable resilience that children often show in the face of trauma, but his recovery came with its own set of complications. He struggled with nightmares and separation anxiety, unable to sleep unless Mrs. Chen or another trusted adult was physically present in his room. He had difficulty concentrating in school, often staring at ceilings and wondering if someone might be hidden above him in other buildings. Simple games of hide-and-seek triggered panic attacks as they reminded him of his terrifying discovery in the attic. Mrs. Chen found herself serving as the family's anchor during this turbulent period, but she too struggled with her own complex emotions. 20 years of caring for the Morrison children had been based on what she now understood to be an elaborate lie. Every conversation she had shared with David Morrison about his late wife, every moment of sympathy she had offered to him as a widowed father, every time she had helped the children cope with their orphaned status, all of it had been built on deception. The guilt of not knowing, not suspecting, not somehow preventing Sarah's imprisonment ate at her despite the rational understanding that she could not have known about something so carefully hidden. The investigation into David Morrison's criminal empire continued to expand, revealing connections to organized crime families across multiple states and uncovering financial crimes that stretched back over 2 decades. Federal prosecutors painted a picture of a man who had started with small-scale money laundering operations and gradually become involved in increasingly serious crimes, using his successful suburban facade to hide activities that included drug trafficking, human smuggling, and eventually the imprisonment of his own wife to protect his criminal lifestyle. The trial became a media sensation, with Sarah's testimony serving as the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Dressed in a simple blue suit that emphasized how frail she still appeared, despite months of medical care, Sarah spoke in a clear, steady voice about 15 years of captivity, of listening to her children grow up without her, of the psychological torture of being presumed dead while life continued around her. Her words were devastating in their simplicity. He didn't just take my freedom. He took my children's childhood. He took 15 years of memories that can never be replaced. Mrs. Chen's testimony provided crucial context for understanding how David Morrison had managed to maintain his deception for so long. Her genuine care for his children had unknowingly helped create the facade of normalcy that hid his crimes from the outside world. When the prosecutor asked her what she wanted people to understand about the case, her answer was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Evil doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it hides behind success and respectability. But love is stronger than evil, and truth is stronger than lies. This family survived because they never stopped loving each other, even when they didn't know if that love could be returned. The verdict was swift and unanimous. David Morrison was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His criminal associates received sentences ranging from 25 years to life, effectively dismantling an organization that had operated in shadows for over 2 decades. But the legal victory, while satisfying, was only the beginning of the Morrison family's journey toward healing and recovery. The community response was overwhelming in its support. Neighbors who had always thought of the Morrisons as a model family now rallied around them with a combination of guilt, sympathy, and determination to help however they could. Local businesses donated services, schools provided counseling resources, and advocacy groups for domestic violence survivors embraced the family as symbols of both the hidden nature of abuse and the possibility of survival and recovery. The Morrison house was eventually demolished, with the lot converted into a small memorial park dedicated to survivors of domestic violence and their families. As autumn turned to winter and then to spring, the Morrison family slowly began to heal. They moved into a modest apartment across town, a space that felt like a palace compared to Sarah's attic prison, but was really just a normal home where a family could live without fear. The simple act of eating dinner together around their kitchen table became a daily celebration of freedom, a reminder that they had survived the unimaginable and emerged stronger on the other side. Miss Chen, now officially adopted as Grandma Chen by all three children, remained a central part of their lives, providing the stability and continuity they needed as they redefined what it meant to be a family. The babysitter who had watched the same house for 20 years had finally discovered what she had really been protecting. Not just the safety of individual children, but the unbreakable bonds of love that connect families even across the darkest circumstances. In the hope that no matter how carefully evil tries to hide itself, truth and justice will eventually find a way to shine through the darkness. 5 years had passed since that terrible October night when Tommy Morrison went missing, and Mrs. Chen discovered the impossible truth that would change their lives forever. The small apartment where the Morrison family now lived was nothing like the grand house where Sarah had been imprisoned for 15 years. But it was filled with something the old house had never truly contained: genuine happiness in the freedom to be a real family. Mrs. Chen, now 71 and officially Grandma Chen to the three Morrison children, sat at the kitchen table watching Sarah help Tommy with his eighth grade science project. The sight still brought tears to her eyes sometimes. A mother helping her child with homework, something so ordinary and precious that most people took it for granted. Sarah had missed 8 years of Tommy's life, but she was making up for lost time with a fierce dedication that inspired everyone who knew her. Emma, now 21 and in her final year of college studying social work, came through the front door carrying textbooks and wearing the confident smile of a young woman who had found her purpose in life. She had chosen to specialize in family reunification services, wanting to help other children who had been separated from their parents by violence, addiction, or other tragedies. The trauma of her own childhood had been transformed into a passion for helping others heal from similar wounds. "How did the presentation go?" Sarah asked, looking up from Tommy's project with the same maternal pride she had been denied for so many years. Emma beamed as she set down her books. "I think I nailed it. The professor said my thesis on long-term family separation was the most compelling research he'd seen in years." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "I told them about us, about what we went through. I hope that's okay." Sarah reached across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand. "I'm proud of you for sharing our story. If it helps even one family, then everything we survived was worth it." Mrs. Chen nodded in agreement, remembering how terrified Sarah had been to speak publicly when she first started advocating for domestic violence survivors. Now she was one of the most requested speakers at conferences and support groups across the country. Jake walked in from his shift at the police academy, where he was training to become a detective specializing in organized crime investigations. At 23, he had found his own way to channel his anger about his father's crimes into something positive, working to catch criminals like David Morrison before they could destroy other families. He kissed his mother on the cheek and ruffled Tommy's hair before grabbing a plate from the cabinet. "Smells good in here. What are we having for dinner?" "Your mom's famous spaghetti," Mrs. Chen announced, though she was the one who had actually prepared the meal. It was a small fiction they all maintained, letting Sarah take credit for the cooking, even though she was still learning to use modern kitchen appliances after 15 years of eating nothing but microwave meals in her attic prison. These little kindnesses helped restore Sarah's sense of being a mother to her children, and Mrs. Chen was happy to provide them. As they gathered around the dinner table, a ritual that never got old for any of them, the conversation turned to the future. Tommy was excited about starting high school next year and had been accepted into an advanced science program. Emma was planning to graduate school to become a licensed therapist. Jake was 6 months away from finishing the police academy and had already received job offers from 3 different departments. Sarah was considering writing a book about her experiences, hoping it might help other survivors understand that healing was possible even after the most unimaginable trauma. Mrs. Chen listened to their plans and dreams with the satisfaction of someone who had watched these children grow up, who had protected them through the darkest period of their lives, and who had helped them discover their own strength and resilience. The babysitter who had watched the same house for 20 years had finally completed her real mission, not just keeping children safe, but helping a family find their way back to each other after evil had tried to tear them apart. After dinner, as they cleaned dishes and prepared for another evening of ordinary family life, Mrs. Chen reflected on how much their lives had changed. The Morrison house had been demolished years ago, replaced by a small park with a memorial garden for domestic violence survivors. David Morrison was serving life in prison and would never again pose a threat to his family or anyone else. His criminal organization had been completely dismantled, and the money he had stolen through decades of illegal activities had been returned to his victims or donated to organizations that help survivors of family violence. But more important than any of that external justice was the healing that had taken place within the four walls of their modest apartment. Tommy no longer had nightmares about hidden rooms and secret passages. Emma had learned to trust again and was building healthy relationships with friends and romantic partners. Jake had channeled his anger into purpose and was about to begin a career dedicated to protecting other families. Sarah had not only survived 15 years of imprisonment, but had emerged as a powerful advocate for change who was helping rewrite laws to better protect vulnerable women and children. As Mrs. Chen tucked Tommy into bed, a ritual she had maintained throughout all the chaos and trauma of the past 5 years, the 13-year-old looked up at her with eyes that still held innocence despite everything he had witnessed. "Grandma Chen," he said quietly, "do you think Dad ever loved us, even though he did those terrible things?" It was a question that all the children had asked in various ways during their years of therapy and healing. Mrs. Chen had learned from the family's counselors that the answer was both complex and important for their recovery. "I think your father was very sick, Tommy. I think there was a part of him that loved you, but it was buried under other feelings that made him do horrible things. The important thing to remember is that what he did was never your fault, and it doesn't change how much your mother loves you, or how much I love you, or how much your brother and sister love you." Tommy nodded solemnly, processing this answer as he had so many others over the years. "I'm glad we found Mom," he said simply. "I'm glad we're all together now." Mrs. Chen kissed his forehead and turned off the light, leaving the door slightly open the way he preferred. Never fully closed, always with a way out, always with the knowledge that help was nearby if he needed it. In the living room, Sarah was reading a book while Emma studied at the kitchen table and Jake watched television with the volume turned low. It was a perfect picture of ordinary family life, the kind of evening that millions of families took for granted, but that represented a miracle for the Morrison family. Mrs. Chen settled into her favorite chair with her own book, surrounded by the people who had become her real family over the course of 25 years. The babysitter who had watched the same house for 20 years had discovered something profound during that terrible night when everything changed. That families are not defined by the buildings where they live or the blood that flows through their veins, but by the love that binds them together and the commitment to protect each other no matter what darkness tries to separate them. She had spent 2 decades thinking she was just taking care of other people's children, but she had actually been part of something much more important. A family that refused to be destroyed by evil, that fought for each other across impossible odds, and that ultimately triumphed through the power of love, truth, and the unbreakable bonds that connect people who choose to stand together against the darkness. As the evening settled into peaceful quiet, and the Morrison family prepared for another night of safe, dreamless sleep, Mrs. Chen reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with a mystery, a child who went missing from his bedroom and strange sounds in the attic. It had continued through a nightmare of hidden rooms and family secrets that seemed too horrible to be real. But it had ended with justice, healing, and the kind of love that proves stronger than any evil that tries to destroy it. The Morrison family's story had become more than just their own personal triumph. It had inspired legislation to better protect domestic violence victims, sparked conversations about the hidden nature of family abuse, and given hope to countless other survivors who had thought their situations were hopeless. Schools now taught children how to recognize signs of abuse and how to seek help safely. Police departments had improved their training for responding to domestic violence calls. Social workers had new tools for identifying and supporting families in crisis. But beyond all the public impact and social change, the most important legacy of their story was the simple truth that love endures, hope survives, and families can heal from even the most devastating trauma if they are willing to fight for each other and accept the help that others offer along the way. Mrs. Chen turned off the living room lights and headed to her own bedroom, grateful for the privilege of having witnessed this family's journey from nightmare to recovery, from lies to truth, from separation to reunion. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities for growth, but it would also bring the simple pleasure of being together as a family, safe, free, and whole. The babysitter who had watched the same house for 20 years had finally completed her mission, not by preventing tragedy, but by helping love triumph over evil, by standing with a family as they fought their way back to each other, and by proving that even the most carefully hidden secrets will eventually be brought into the light by people who refuse to give up hope. In the darkness of her bedroom, Mrs. Chen whispered a prayer of gratitude for the Morrison family, for the strength they had shown, for the love they had preserved, and for the privilege she had been given to be part of their story. And in the other bedrooms of their small apartment, Sarah Morrison slept peacefully beside her children for another night, free at last from the attic prison where she had spent 15 years dreaming of this exact moment, safe, together, and surrounded by the love that had never stopped burning, even in the deepest darkness. The Morrison family had survived the unthinkable and emerged stronger, proving that no matter how powerful evil seems, love is always more powerful in the end. After witnessing the Morrison family's incredible journey from darkness to light, which part of their story touched your heart the most? Share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. Your stories of hope and resilience might inspire someone who needs to hear them today.